Georgia Chapman opened the front door, expecting roses. Instead, a woman stood on her porch with rain in her hair, a baby on her hip, and a manila envelope trembling in her hand. "I'm Alyssa Monroe," the woman said, her voice cracking. "Jerome's business partner." Behind Georgia, silverware clinked in the dining room, where Jerome was laughing with his parents like he had not built a second life behind her back. Alyssa held out the envelope. Georgia opened it. Paternity test results. Jerome Chapman, biological father. The hallway went silent. Then Alyssa whispered, "He told me you already knew." Georgia turned slowly toward the dining room, and Jerome's face went white. "If betrayal showed up at your door, holding proof, would you scream, 'Walk away,' or invite the truth inside?" Comment your answer below and stay with Georgia, because this night was only the beginning. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. The chandelier above the dining table cast warm, golden light across crystal glasses, polished silverware, and the smiling family portrait hanging on the wall behind Jerome Chapman. It was the kind of dining room designed to impress investors and politicians, the kind that appeared in luxury magazines under headlines about power couples and American success. And right in the center of it stood a frightened young woman holding a baby that looked disturbingly like Jerome. Georgia felt her heartbeat inside her throat. Jerome pushed his chair back so abruptly it scraped against the marble floor. "What the hell is this?" he snapped. Alyssa flinched. The baby stirred against her shoulder with a soft whimper. Georgia noticed something strange then. Jerome did not look heartbroken. He looked inconvenienced. Like someone whose meeting had been interrupted. Like someone angry that a secret had arrived 15 minutes too early. Elaine Chapman slowly lowered her wineglass. "Jerome, this is nothing," Jerome said immediately, forcing out a laugh that sounded brittle. "She's unstable. I told you this would happen eventually." Alyssa stared at him in disbelief. "Unstable," she whispered. "You told me you loved me." Walter Chapman remained silent at the end of the table, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Georgia stood near the doorway, clutching the envelope so tightly the edges bent in her hands. Nobody had asked if she was okay. Not Jerome, not Elaine, not Walter. The realization landed colder than the betrayal itself. Jerome walked toward Alyssa, quickly lowering his voice. "This is not the place for this conversation." "You said your marriage was over," Alyssa shot back. "You said she already knew about the baby." George's stomach twisted. Jerome turned toward her with practiced calm, the same calm he used with clients, the same polished voice that had built million-dollar contracts. "Georgia, sweetheart, don't do this here." Sweetheart. He had not called her that in almost a year. Georgia looked at him carefully, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. The tailored navy sweater. The expensive watch she bought him for their 10th anniversary. The tiny vein pulsing near his temple. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Alyssa stepped farther into the dining room and placed the paternity test on the table between the candles and untouched food. The room looked absurdly beautiful for a marriage that had just died. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," Alyssa said shakily. "I came because Jerome stopped answering my calls after the baby was born." Elaine inhaled sharply. "Baby," she repeated faintly. Georgia almost laughed at the irony of it. Elaine sounded shocked now, but Georgia suddenly remembered all the strange moments from the past year. Elaine insisting Jerome was under pressure. Elaine encouraging Georgia to be patient with successful men. Elaine avoiding eye contact every time Georgia mentioned how distant Jerome had become. The puzzle pieces were rearranging themselves into something ugly. Jerome rubbed both hands over his face. "Can we stop being dramatic?" Georgia blinked slowly. Dramatic. A woman appearing with his child at their front door was apparently dramatic. Not the affair itself. Not the lies. Not the second apartment. Not the child. Only the exposure. Alyssa pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "Do you want me to read your texts out loud too?" Jerome's expression darkened instantly. Alyssa. "No," she interrupted. "You don't get to shut me up anymore." She opened her phone. You said, her voice cracked as she read, "Georgia and I are basically business partners now. We sleep in separate rooms." Georgia felt something inside her chest split open quietly, not because she believed him, because she remembered the nights he had turned away from her in bed claiming exhaustion, because she remembered asking softly, "Did I do something wrong?" and Jerome kissing her forehead absently before saying, "You worry too much." Walter finally spoke. "Jerome," he said carefully, "is the child yours?" Silence. Jerome looked trapped now, cornered, but even then his eyes went to Georgia first, calculating the damage. Not grieving, calculating. Alyssa laughed bitterly through tears. "Wow, you still can't even answer your father honestly." The baby began crying louder. Instinctively, Georgia reached for the diaper bag hanging off Alyssa's shoulder before she even thought about it. Everyone stared at her. Georgia froze. Even now, her first instinct had been to help. The realization humiliated her. Alyssa's eyes softened unexpectedly. "Her bottle's inside." Georgia handed the bag over quietly. Jerome exhaled in frustration. "Can we please stop acting like this is some kind of tragedy?" Georgia turned toward him slowly. Somewhere deep inside her, something fragile finally snapped. "You had a child with another woman," she said softly. "At what point exactly should this start feeling tragic to you?" Jerome's face hardened. "There's no reason to make this uglier than it already is. There's already a baby at the dinner table, Jerome," Georgia replied. "I think ugly arrived before I did." Walter looked away, and that was when Georgia noticed it. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You knew," she said quietly. Walter stiffened. Elaine immediately spoke too fast. "Georgia, please don't jump to conclusions." Georgia looked directly at her mother-in-law. "You knew." Elaine swallowed hard. It wasn't supposed to become serious. The sentence hit Georgia harder than the paternity test. Not supposed to become serious, as though her humiliation was merely an inconvenience that escalated too far. Jerome stepped forward. "Mom, stop talking." But Elaine was already unraveling. "You've been distant for months," she told Georgia defensively. Jerome said the marriage was struggling. "So cheating was easier than honesty?" Georgia asked. "No one is defending cheating," Elaine replied quickly. "You literally just defended cheating." Silence swallowed the room again. Jerome's composure finally cracked. "This is exactly why I didn't want this happening publicly," he snapped. "Everything becomes emotional with you." Georgia stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly everything made sense. Every time he lied, he called her emotional. Every time she questioned him, she became difficult. Every time he hurt her, she became the problem for reacting to pain. It had never been accountability, only manipulation dressed up as sophistication. Alyssa slowly sat down at the far end of the table, exhausted. The baby had fallen asleep against her chest. Georgia looked at the child for a long moment. None of this was the baby's fault. That hurt somehow, too. Jerome stepped toward Georgia, carefully lowering his voice again. "Let's go upstairs and talk privately." There it was. Control. Containment. Management. The Jerome Chapman method. Georgia looked at him with terrifying calm. "How long?" she asked. Jerome hesitated. "Georgia, how long have you been building another life behind my back?" No one breathed. Not Walter. Not Elaine. Not Alyssa. Jerome opened his mouth, and for the first time in 12 years of marriage, Georgia realized she no longer trusted a single word that came out of it. Jerome did not answer immediately. That terrified Georgia more than if he had simply confessed, because silence meant calculation. It meant he was searching for the version of the truth most useful to him. Finally, Jerome exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his dark hair. "This didn't happen the way it looks." Georgia almost admired the audacity. A baby, a paternity test, a second woman standing in their dining room. And somehow Jerome still believed reality could be negotiated like one of his corporate contracts. Alyssa let out a hollow laugh from the far end of the table. "You said that to me too." Jerome shot her a warning look. "Enough." "No," Georgia said quietly. Everyone looked at her. For years, Georgia had been the calm one, the accommodating one, the woman who smoothed tension before it became conflict. She hosted the dinners, remembered birthdays, sent thank you cards, covered Jerome's absences with graceful excuses and polished smiles. Tonight she was suddenly too tired to protect anyone anymore. How long, she repeated. Jerome's jaw tightened. "A few months." Alyssa stared at him in disbelief. "A few months," she echoed. Jerome, I got pregnant over a year ago. Elaine closed her eyes briefly like someone developing a migraine. Walter stood and walked toward the bar cart near the windows overlooking the dark backyard. No one stopped him. Georgia looked at Jerome carefully. "A year," she whispered. Her voice did not break. That almost scared her. Jerome stepped closer. "Georgia, please. This is complicated." "No," she said softly. "It's actually very simple." She looked at the sleeping baby in Alyssa's arms. "You cheated on me long enough to create a child." The truth settled over the room like smoke after a fire. Jerome looked frustrated now, as though Georgia's pain was becoming inconveniently dramatic again. "You're reducing everything down to one mistake." Georgia stared at him. One mistake. Not months of lies, not secret apartments, not fake business trips, not another woman waiting for his calls, while Georgia sat at home defending him to friends and family. One mistake. Her mind drifted backward against her will. 12 years earlier. A tiny apartment in Brooklyn with unreliable heat and water stains on the ceiling. Jerome sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by papers and business plans. Georgia kneeling beside him with takeout containers balanced on her lap. "You really think this consulting firm can work?" he had asked nervously. Georgia remembered smiling. "No," she had teased. "I know it will." Back then, Jerome used to look at her like she was magic, like her belief in him gave him permission to believe in himself. Georgia had been 28 and brilliant. She worked at a respected architecture firm in Manhattan, designing boutique hotel interiors, while Jerome bounced between unstable jobs and impossible ambitions. Everyone told her Jerome dreamed too big. Georgia loved him for dreaming at all. When Chapman and Vail Consulting launched, the first office had been barely larger than a storage closet. Georgia designed the entire space herself after working full-time all day. She painted walls at midnight, wearing one of Jerome's old college shirts. She negotiated furniture deals, managed early client events, edited Jerome's presentations, introduced him to one of her former clients who became Chapman and Vail's first major investor. And when Jerome panicked before his first corporate pitch, Georgia stayed awake until 3 a.m. rehearsing with him. "You're the reason this company exists," Jerome whispered to her and afterward, kissing her forehead in the taxi home. At the time, she believed him. God, she had believed everything. The company grew fast after that, faster than either of them expected. There were magazine profiles, networking galas, luxury vacations, private schools for future children they kept postponing because Jerome was almost at the next level. Georgia slowly became less of a wife and more of a support system disguised as a woman. She noticed it gradually. Jerome interrupting her during dinners. Jerome introducing her as the glue at home instead of mentioning her career. Jerome encouraging her to leave architecture because his schedule had become too demanding. "You don't need to work," he told her. At the time it sounded romantic. Now she realized it had been strategic. Dependence always looks gentle at first. Georgia remembered the exact moment she resigned from her firm. She had stood in front of the bathroom mirror, afterward crying silently, while Jerome celebrated with champagne in the kitchen. "You'll finally get to relax," he told her. "Relax." As if abandoning herself had been self-care. The years after that blurred together in elegant loneliness. Georgia became exceptional at anticipating everyone else's needs. Elaine liked white roses at family dinners. Walter hated loud restaurants. Jerome preferred his suits color-coordinated before major meetings. Georgia remembered all of it. But nobody remembered Georgia, not really. The room around her returned slowly into focus. Alyssa was feeding the baby quietly now. Walter stood by the window, nursing whiskey. Elaine looked exhausted. Jerome looked impatient. Georgia suddenly saw the entire marriage clearly, not as one catastrophic betrayal, but as 1,000 smaller betrayals stacked carefully on top of each other until the weight finally crushed everything beneath it. "How long has your mother known?" Georgia asked. Elaine stiffened immediately. "Georgia." "How long?" Jerome stepped in sharply. "Leave my parents out of this." "Oh, now family has boundaries," Georgia asked calmly. Walter finally spoke without turning around. "We found out 6 months ago." The words punched through her chest. 6 months. 6 months of Sunday dinners, holiday parties, wine tastings, family photos. Elaine squeezed Georgia's hand across tables while secretly knowing Jerome was sleeping with another woman. Georgia felt physically ill. Elaine stood abruptly. We were trying to protect the marriage. Georgia looked at her slowly. You were trying to protect Jerome. Elaine's eyes filled with frustrated tears. You don't understand what pressure men like Jerome live under. A strange sound escaped Georgia then. It took her a moment to realize she was laughing. Not because anything was funny, because the absurdity finally became unbearable. Pressure. Successful men. Complicated situations. Every excuse in the world except accountability. You know what's incredible, Georgia said quietly. If I had cheated, none of you would be explaining my stress levels right now. Nobody answered, because everyone in the room knew she was right. Jerome walked toward her again, carefully lowering his voice like someone approaching a dangerous ledge. Georgia, sweetheart, let's not destroy everything over this. Everything. Another fascinating word choice. Not us, not our marriage. Everything. The company, the image, the lifestyle, the reputation. Georgia looked at the man she had once loved enough to rearrange her entire future around, and for the first time she realized something devastating. Jerome had never truly believed she would leave, not because he respected her loyalty, because he underestimated her self-worth. That realization hurt more than the affair itself. Alyssa suddenly spoke softly. He told me you were cold. Georgia turned toward her. Alyssa looked ashamed. He said you only cared about appearances, that the marriage died years ago. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. Men like Jerome always rewrote women into villains before betraying them. It made them feel cleaner, less guilty, more justified. When Georgia opened her eyes again, something inside her had changed. Not healed, not stronger, just awake, completely awake. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the staircase. Georgia, Jerome called after her. She stopped halfway up the stairs but did not look back. Did you ever love me? She asked quietly. Or did you just love how much I loved you? Silence. And somehow that silence answered everything. Georgia continued upstairs, into the bedroom, into the life she no longer recognized, into the beginning of the end. Georgia did not cry when she reached the bedroom. That surprised her. For years, tears had come easily in private. Quiet tears in bathroom stalls after Jerome embarrassed her at dinners. Silent tears in bed when he rolled away and told her he was tired. Hot, ashamed tears in the shower when she wondered what part of herself had become so unlovable. But tonight nothing came. Only stillness. A dangerous, unfamiliar stillness. Downstairs, muffled voices rose and fell beneath the floorboards. Jerome's voice was the loudest, sharp, and controlled. Elaine's was thinner, panicked. Alyssa's voice came in broken pieces. The baby cried once, then quieted. Georgia stood in the center of the bedroom she had decorated 6 years ago. Cream linen curtains, Italian lamps, a custom headboard she designed herself, a wedding photo on the dresser framed in silver. She looked at that photo for a long moment. Jerome had his arm around her waist. Georgia was laughing, her veil blowing across her cheek. She remembered thinking that day, I am safe now. I am chosen. How cruel memory could be. She turned away. Her eyes landed on the small built-in cabinet near the window. It had always looked decorative, but behind the lower panel was a lockbox she had not opened in years. Georgia knelt, reached behind a stack of old design magazines, and pulled out the brass key taped underneath the shelf. Her fingers were steady. That scared her more than shaking would have. The lock clicked open. Inside were the forgotten bones of her old life, architecture licenses, early sketches, a few photographs from her first completed hotel project, her mother's estate paperwork, and beneath all of it, a thick blue folder labeled Chapman and Vale Formation Documents. Georgia lifted it out like something sacred. She remembered signing those papers in a cramped law office when Jerome still wore discount suits and spoke too quickly when nervous. He had squeezed her hand under the conference table and whispered, "One day I'll give you everything." But she had already given him the first everything, the inheritance from her mother, the connections, the unpaid labor, the belief. Georgia opened the folder. Page after page confirmed what Jerome had spent years making her forget. Initial capital contribution. Georgia Elaine Chapman. equity allocation, silent founding partner, profit participation rights, protective ownership clause, signature, Jerome Michael Chapman, signature, Georgia Elaine Chapman. Her throat tightened, but still no tears came, because grief was becoming something else now, clarity. The bedroom door opened. Jerome stepped inside without knocking. Of course he did. He stopped when he saw the folder in her lap. For the first time that night, real alarm crossed his face. "What are you doing?" he asked. Georgia looked down at the documents, remembering. Jerome closed the door behind him carefully. His voice softened instantly. "Georgia, baby, this is getting out of control." She almost smiled. He was choosing the tender voice now, the one he used when he wanted forgiveness without confession. "Is it?" she asked. He took a slow step toward her. "Yes. Alyssa showing up here like that was inappropriate. She's emotional. She just had a baby. She's not thinking clearly." Georgia looked at him. "And you are," he inhaled sharply. "I'm trying to save our marriage." "No," Georgia said. "You're trying to save your reputation." His eyes flickered, a tiny crack. Then he recovered. "Those are the same thing right now." And there it was, the truth dressed as strategy. Georgia placed the first contract page on the bed between them. "This says I own part of Chapman and Vale." Jerome's expression tightened. "That's old. Legal documents don't expire because they embarrass you." He laughed once coldly. "Don't start talking like a lawyer because you found a folder." Georgia tilted her head. "Why does it make you nervous?" His jaw flexed. For a moment, she saw the man behind the polish, the man who hated being challenged by the woman he had trained everyone to underestimate. Jerome sat on the edge of the bed too close. "Listen to me," he said. "Yes, I handled things badly." Georgia's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Handled things badly?" He ignored that. "But Alyssa was never my future. You are my wife. You're the woman beside me. You're the one people respect." Georgia absorbed the sentence. Not love, not cherish, not need, respect. People respected her as an accessory to him. That was the highest compliment he could currently offer. "Where does your child fit into this polished little plan?" she asked. Jerome looked irritated. "I'll support the child financially. The child has a name." He hesitated. Georgia stared at him. "You don't even want to say your own baby's name in front of me. That's not fair." "No, Jerome. What's not fair is learning my marriage has a second address." His eyes sharpened. "What did she tell you enough?" "Alyssa exaggerates." "Did you rent her an apartment in Boston?" He stood immediately. That was answer enough. Georgia's pulse slowed. Not quickened. Slowed. A strange calm moved through her body. She turned another page in the folder. "Did you use company funds?" Jerome's face hardened. "Be careful." The warning was quiet, almost gentle. But Georgia heard the threat underneath. For years, that tone would have made her retreat. Tonight, it made her focus. "Did you use company funds to pay for the apartment where your mistress lived with your baby?" "Do not call her that." Georgia looked up. Something flashed in Jerome's eyes. And suddenly she understood. He was not defending Alyssa. He was defending the fantasy, the separate world where he was still desired, still powerful, still untouched by consequences. Georgia reached for the stack of bank statements tucked inside the folder. She had printed them months ago when she noticed odd charges, but let Jerome convince her they were vendor retainers. Northline Strategy Services, monthly payments, same amount, same date, too neat, too clean. She laid the statements beside the contract. "What is Northline Strategy Services?" Jerome went still. It was almost beautiful the way guilt could freeze a man who thought himself untouchable. "A vendor," he said. "For what market research?" "Interesting. Because market research usually doesn't require luxury residential billing cycles." His face darkened. "You've been going through company records, I've been going through my life." Jerome stepped closer. "Georgia, you do not understand the complexity of corporate operations." There it was again. The gentle condescension, the polished insult. Georgia stood folder in hand. "I understood them well enough when I helped you build the company from a borrowed conference room." Jerome's mouth tightened. "That was different, because back then you needed me." Silence. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." That one answered itself. He reached for her arm. She stepped back before he could touch her. The movement shocked them both. Jerome stared at the space between his hand and her body, like she had rewritten a law of nature. Georgia, no. One conversation, he said. We've had 12 years of conversations. You just lied through most of them. His expression shifted then. Tenderness gone. Now came anger. You want to blow up your life over one woman who meant nothing? George's voice dropped. Alyssa has your child, and I said I'll handle it. You keep saying handle Jerome. Like people are problems on a spreadsheet, he pointed toward the documents. And what exactly do you think you're going to do with those? Georgia looked down at the folder, then at the phone lying on the dresser, then back at him. I don't know yet, she said. It was the first lie she had told him that night, because she knew exactly what she was going to do first. Document everything. Jerome exhaled, mistaking her quiet for weakness. Good. Then let's be smart. We keep this private. Alyssa gets financial support. My parents, calm down. You and I present a united front until this passes. This, the scandal. Georgia stared at him. Not the betrayal, not the child, not the marriage collapsing. The scandal. His greatest fear had never been losing her, only being seen clearly. She turned away and opened the top drawer of her dresser, pretending to search for tissues. Instead, she angled her phone toward the documents and took a silent photo. Then another, and another. Jerome kept talking behind her. We have too much at stake. The house, the company, the board, our social circle. You don't want to become some bitter divorced woman everyone whispers about. Click. Georgia photographed the Northline statements. Click. The original equity clause. Click. Jerome's signature. You're emotional right now, he continued. And when women are emotional, they make expensive mistakes. Georgia paused. Slowly she turned. For one clear second, she saw him exactly as he was. Not complicated. Not pressured. Not misunderstood. Small. A small man standing in a beautiful room built partly by the woman he had tried to erase. Georgia closed the folder. You're right, she said softly. Jerome blinked, relieved. Good. Finally. I don't want to make an expensive mistake. His shoulders lowered. So we agree. That's why I'm going to be very careful. The relief vanished from his face. Georgia walked past him toward the door. Where are you going? She stopped with her hand on the knob. To get some air, Georgia. She looked back. Jerome stood beside their wedding photo, surrounded by the ruins of the version of himself she used to love. For a heartbeat, she wanted to ask why. Why wasn't she enough? Why did he humiliate her? Why did he let his family know while she smiled beside them like a fool? But she already understood something painful. Some questions only keep you tied to people who will never answer honestly. So Georgia said nothing. She walked down the hallway, entered the guest bathroom, locked the door, and opened her messages. Her thumb hovered for one moment. Then she typed, Sam, I need you. Tonight. Samantha Keller replied less than 30 seconds later. Tell me where you are. And Georgia, don't confront him again without recording everything. Georgia stared at the screen. Downstairs, Jerome called her name. This time she did not answer. Manhattan looked cold from the back seat of the car. Rain streaked across the windows in silver lines, while Georgia sat motionless beneath the glow of passing streetlights. The city blurred around her in reflections of gold and black glass, expensive restaurants, crowded sidewalks, and people hurrying through lives that still made sense. Her own life no longer did. She had left the house 30 minutes earlier after Jerome finally stopped knocking on the guest bathroom door. He had switched tactics twice before she walked out. First anger, then guilt, then concern. Georgia. You're exhausted. Let's talk tomorrow. You're not thinking clearly. Every sentence translated into the same thing. Stay manageable. Georgia stared down at her phone again. Sam Keller had texted her the address to her office tower in Midtown. 34th floor, private entrance, discreet. Of course it was. Samantha Keller was the kind of divorce attorney wealthy men feared mentioning out loud. Georgia remembered Sam very differently. College apartment, messy curls, cheap wine, sharp tongue, brilliant mind. Back then, Sam used to say, "One day I'm going to make arrogant men cry professionally." Apparently, she had succeeded. The car stopped outside a sleek black building overlooking the city. Georgia stepped onto the wet pavement and hugged her coat tighter around herself. For one brief second, she almost got back into the car, because walking into a divorce lawyer's office made everything real. Not wounded, not repairable, real. But then she remembered Jerome standing beside their wedding photo, calling his affair a scandal. And Georgia walked inside. The elevator ride to the 34th floor felt strangely silent. The doors opened into a softly lit reception area with dark wood walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. A receptionist immediately stood. Mrs. Chapman, Georgia almost flinched at the name. "Yes, Ms. Keller is waiting for you." The office smelled faintly like coffee and expensive paper. Sam stood the moment Georgia entered. For a heartbeat, neither woman spoke. Then Sam crossed the room quickly and pulled Georgia into a tight hug. That nearly broke her. Not the affair, not the baby, not the lies. Kindness. Kindness almost destroyed her. "Oh, honey," Sam whispered. "You look like hell." Georgia laughed weakly against her shoulder. "That bad worse." They pulled apart. Sam studied her carefully. Georgia suddenly became aware of herself through another person's eyes. Smudged mascara, rain-damp hair, wedding ring still on her finger. A woman trying very hard not to fall apart. Sam gestured toward the leather couch near the windows. "Sit." Georgia sat carefully, clutching the blue folder against her chest like armor. Sam poured 2 glasses of water before sitting across from her. "No bullshit," Sam said gently. "Tell me everything." And Georgia did. At first the words came slowly. A woman at the door. A baby. A paternity test. Jerome lying. Elaine already knowing. The apartment. The company money. The fake vendor. But once she started, the pain poured out in pieces she had apparently been carrying for years. Georgia spoke about Jerome growing colder, about feeling invisible in her own marriage, about shrinking herself so Jerome could continue feeling large. At one point, her voice cracked unexpectedly. "I spent years thinking if I loved him better, he'd come back to me." Sam's expression tightened. "Georgia." "But he was already gone," Georgia whispered. Silence settled between them. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered, indifferently, beneath the rain. Sam finally leaned forward. "Listen to me very carefully," she said. "None of this happened because you were lacking." Georgia looked away immediately, because somewhere deep inside she still believed it had. Maybe if she had stayed younger, more exciting, more ambitious, less emotional. Maybe if she had fought harder for him. Sam seemed to read every thought crossing her face. "That man cheated because cheating served him," Sam said sharply, "not because another woman failed him." Georgia swallowed hard. Sam held out her hand. "The folder." Georgia passed it over. Sam opened the documents methodically, her expression becoming more focused with every page. The original equity agreement, bank statements, vendor payments, corporate filings. Then Sam stopped. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait." She pulled out one of the more recent company amendments. "Did you sign this?" Georgia leaned closer. The signature at the bottom looked like hers, except it wasn't. Her stomach dropped instantly. "No." Sam looked up slowly. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Georgia, this document removes voting protection from your original equity clause." The room suddenly felt colder. Georgia stared at the page. Jerome's signature sat beside the forged version of her own. Neat, clean, calculated, like he had already been preparing for war long before she even knew she was standing on a battlefield. Sam's voice sharpened professionally now. "Did Jerome ever pressure you to sign documents quickly all the time? Did you sometimes?" Sam nodded grimly. "We'll need a forensic handwriting analyst." Georgia blinked. The conversation had shifted so far beyond heartbreak she almost couldn't process it. This wasn't only betrayal anymore. It was strategy, planning, protection. Jerome had not merely cheated. He had been rearranging the architecture of her life behind her back. Sam kept flipping through papers. "These Northline strategy payments." She tapped the statements. "You said the apartment was in Boston." Georgia nodded. And Jerome claimed this was a consulting vendor, yes. Sam let out a humorless laugh. He's either arrogant or stupid, both Georgia whispered before she could stop herself. To her surprise, Sam smiled. There she is. Georgia frowned slightly. What? The woman I remember. Georgia looked confused. Sam leaned back against the couch. In college, you were terrifying. Georgia almost laughed. No, I wasn't. You absolutely were. You walked into rooms like you belonged there. Professors loved you because you challenged them. Men loved you because you intimidated them. That sounds dramatic. It's accurate. Georgia looked down at her hands. Somewhere over the years, she had become smaller, quieter, softer around Jerome's ego. Sam's expression gentled. What happened to you? The question hurt because Georgia honestly did not know. Maybe nothing dramatic happened all at once. Maybe women disappeared slowly, one compromise at a time, one postponed dream, one apology for being too much, until eventually there was barely enough left to recognize. Georgia stared out the window. I think I loved him more than I loved myself. The honesty of it sat heavily between them. Sam nodded once. That happens more often than you think. Georgia finally removed her wedding ring and placed it on the glass coffee table. The tiny sound it made felt enormous. Her eyes burned instantly, not because she wanted Jerome back, because she suddenly realized how long she had been mourning herself inside that marriage. Sam noticed the tears immediately, but did not rush to comfort her. Georgia appreciated that. Pity would have shattered her faster than pain. Instead, Sam reached for a legal pad. Okay, she said calmly. Here's what we do next. Something inside Georgia steadied slightly. Sam began outlining strategy with surgical precision. Freeze financial movement. Secure evidence. Copy everything. Do not warn Jerome. Avoid emotional confrontations unless recorded. Document every conversation. Protect personal accounts. Prepare emergency filings if Jerome attempts asset transfers. Georgia listened carefully, overwhelmed by how quickly survival replaced grief when someone finally told you the truth. You really think he'd move money? She asked quietly. Sam looked up flatly. I think wealthy men become very creative when consequences arrive. Georgia almost smiled despite herself. Then Sam's expression darkened again. One more thing. What if Jerome forged your signature? This is no longer just divorce territory. Georgia's pulse slowed. What does that mean? It means your husband may have committed fraud. The word hung in the office like thunder waiting to break. Fraud. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. The man she married had once kissed paint off her fingertips in a tiny apartment while promising to build a life with her. Now she was sitting in a Manhattan law office discussing whether he forged legal documents to erase her. Human beings could become strangers so gradually you barely noticed until the damage was complete. Sam leaned forward again. Georgia. She opened her eyes. This is important. Sam's voice softened slightly. You do not need to protect him anymore. That sentence pierced deeper than anything else that night, because beneath all the anger and betrayal, Georgia realized something horrifying. Part of her still wanted Jerome safe, still wanted to minimize the explosion, still wanted to bleed quietly so everyone else could remain comfortable. Sam saw the realization cross her face. Georgia, she said firmly, he broke the marriage. You are not responsible for making his destruction look graceful. Georgia inhaled shakily. Outside, rain hammered against the windows while Manhattan glowed beneath the storm. For the first time all night, she no longer felt numb. She felt awake, terrified, heartbroken, but awake. Sam closed the folder carefully. Then she looked directly at Georgia and said the words that changed everything. This isn't just divorce, she said quietly. It's war with receipts. Georgia barely slept. She returned to the mansion just before dawn because Sam advised her not to disappear suddenly. Not yet. Not until documents were secured. Not until Jerome stopped believing he still controlled the narrative. The house was silent when she walked inside. Too silent. Like the walls themselves were listening. A faint smell of expensive whiskey lingered in the air from the previous night. One of the crystal glasses remained abandoned on the dining table beside the folded paternity test. No one had cleaned up. The evidence of destruction still sat exactly where it had exploded. Georgia stood there for a moment staring at it. A baby changed everything. Not because of biology, because babies made lies permanent. Jerome could deny feelings, deny timelines, deny promises. But he could not deny a child forever. Georgia slowly removed her coat and walked toward the staircase. Georgia. His voice stopped her halfway up. Jerome stood near the kitchen entrance wearing gray sweatpants and a black cashmere sweater, like a man in a luxury fragrance advertisement pretending his life was not collapsing. He looked exhausted. Good. Georgia said nothing. I've been waiting for you. That sounds uncomfortable. His eyes narrowed slightly. The old Georgia would have softened the edge of that sentence immediately. This version did not. Jerome walked toward her carefully. We need to talk rationally. There's that word again. What word? Rationally. Georgia gave a faint, humorless smile. Men always start demanding rationality the moment women finally react to betrayal. His jaw flexed. I'm trying to fix this. No, she corrected quietly. You're trying to contain it. The silence stretched between them. Jerome finally sighed and gestured toward the sitting room. Please. Georgia followed him only because Sam told her something important before she left the office. When people think they still have power, they reveal everything. The sitting room overlooked the backyard pool and winter garden. Morning light spilled through the enormous windows, pale and cold against the marble floors. Jerome remained standing while Georgia sat in the armchair across from him. Interesting. He wanted the physical advantage. Control existed in posture, too. Jerome rubbed a hand across his face dramatically. I didn't sleep. Georgia almost laughed. Neither had the woman whose husband fathered another child, but somehow Jerome still positioned himself as the exhausted victim. What exactly do you want from me right now? She asked. He looked relieved to hear something practical. Finally. Thank you. The arrogance of that sentence settled under her skin. Jerome paced slowly as he spoke. We have a situation. A situation. Not a betrayal. Not a marriage imploding. A situation. Georgia remained quiet. Jerome continued. Alyssa showing up here was reckless. Emotional. But we can still manage this if everyone calms down. Manage. Another favorite word. Georgia wondered if he even heard himself anymore. She and the baby can be taken care of privately, Jerome said. Discreetly. Georgia stared at him. Privately? Yes. Your child should remain hidden so your reputation survives. His frustration flickered immediately. Why are you twisting everything I say? Because everything you say is twisted already, she thought. Instead, she asked calmly, what exactly is your plan? Jerome visibly relaxed again, mistaking her composure for cooperation. That was his first mistake. You and I stay together publicly, he said. No separation announcement. No legal drama. We present stability. Georgia watched him carefully. Not once had he asked whether she still wanted the marriage, because Jerome assumed wanting him was permanent. Alyssa receives financial support, he continued. The child's future is secured. My parents smooth things socially. The board never needs details. The board... Georgia repeated softly. Jerome paused. Too late. Georgia noticed. His eyes sharpened instantly. You told me this was about saving the marriage. It is. No, she said quietly. It's about protecting Chapman and Vale. His expression hardened slightly. That company supports our entire life. There it was. Our life. The mansion. The clubs. The vacations. The donor galas. Jerome thought material comfort could still negotiate away emotional devastation. Georgia suddenly remembered something Sam said hours earlier. Dependence always looks luxurious before it becomes a cage. Jerome sat across from her finally. His voice softened deliberately. Georgia, look at everything we've built. She almost flinched at the word we, because now she could see how selectively Jerome used partnership. When success happened, it became his company. When scandal happened suddenly, it became their life. You mean everything I helped you build? She asked. His eyes darkened instantly. You're not seriously trying to claim ownership right now. Claim ownership. As if her existence inside the company had been imaginary. Georgia leaned back slowly. I funded the launch. You supported me emotionally. Georgia stared at him. Then she laughed softly. Not warmly, not kindly. The sound unsettled him more than screaming would have. Emotionally, she repeated. Jerome exhaled impatiently. Don't do this. No, Jerome. Let's do this carefully. She began counting calmly on her fingers. My inheritance funded your first office. One finger. I designed every early presentation package. Second finger. I introduced you to Martin Kessler. Jerome's face tightened immediately at the investor's name. Third finger. I hosted your networking events for free. Fourth finger. I left my own career because you said the company needed me. Fifth finger. Then Georgia lowered her hand slowly. You became successful standing on sacrifices you trained me to call love. Silence crashed through the room. Jerome's face changed. For the first time since the scandal broke, genuine anger surfaced beneath the polish. You're being dramatic. There it was again. Georgia almost admired the consistency. A woman discovering betrayal was dramatic. A woman remembering her own value was dramatic. A woman refusing humiliation quietly was dramatic. Jerome leaned forward. You know what I think Georgia said? Nothing. I think you're embarrassed. His voice became sharper now. I think this whole thing wounded your pride and now you want revenge. Revenge. Interesting how men called it revenge the moment women stopped absorbing pain silently. Georgia folded her hands in her lap. You had a baby with another woman, and I said, I'll handle it. You keep saying that like people are invoices. His expression darkened further. You know what your problem is, he snapped. You always make emotions bigger than reality. Georgia looked at him steadily. No, I just finally stopped shrinking reality to protect your comfort. That landed. She saw it, the slight flicker in his eyes. Jerome stood abruptly and walked toward the bar cart. Even at 8 a.m, he poured himself whiskey. Georgia watched the movement carefully. Cracks. Finally. Jerome swallowed half the glass before speaking again. You need to understand the position you're in. There it was. Not apology. Threat. Georgia's pulse slowed. What position is that? Jerome turned toward her slowly. If this becomes public, you lose too. Georgia almost smiled, because he still believed fear worked. You think people will side with you? He continued. You think anyone cares who helped decorate presentations 15 years ago? Decorate. That word hit harder than it should have. Not build. Decorate. Like her entire contribution had been floral arrangements around Jerome's genius. You were my wife, Jerome said coldly. Not my business partner. Georgia tilted her head slightly. That's interesting. What? Because I found documents last night that disagree with you. For the first time, real panic flashed across his face before disappearing, too fast for most people to notice, not too fast for Georgia. And suddenly she understood something terrifying. Jerome was not afraid of losing her. He was afraid of paper trails. His voice became careful again. What documents? Georgia shrugged lightly. The ones with my name on them. He stared at her, calculating, recalculating. The silence stretched so long Georgia could practically hear him building strategies inside his head. Then Jerome made his second mistake. You don't understand corporate structures well enough to interpret old agreements. Condescension. Always condescension. Georgia kept her expression neutral while quietly reaching into her coat pocket. Her phone. Recording. Exactly like Sam instructed. Jerome continued talking unaware. The board trusts me. The investors trust me. My father already spoke to someone who understands how ugly divorces can become when emotional women start chasing money. Georgia went very still. Your father spoke to who Jerome immediately realized he said too much, but it was already there, recorded, evidence. Georgia stared at him for a long moment. Then something inside her shifted completely. Because suddenly this was no longer only about infidelity, it was about power, control, erasure. Jerome had never expected her to fight back because no one in that family had ever viewed her as dangerous, only useful. Georgia stood slowly. Jerome frowned. Where are you going? She slipped the phone deeper into her pocket. Then she looked directly at the man she once believed would protect her from the world. Instead, he had become the thing she needed protection from. Thank you, she said softly. Jerome blinked. For what? Georgia held his gaze. For finally saying everything out loud. And for the first time since Alyssa appeared at the front door, Jerome Chapman looked genuinely afraid. Jerome did not follow her upstairs this time. That alone told Georgia he was nervous. Men like Jerome only became quiet when they sensed consequences moving beneath them. Georgia locked the bedroom door behind her and finally exhaled. Her hands trembled now, not from weakness, from adrenaline. The confrontation downstairs replayed through her mind in sharp fragments. Emotional women. The board trusts me. My father spoke to someone. Every sentence stripped another layer off the man she married. Georgia crossed the room and opened her laptop with deliberate care. Sam had given her instructions before sunrise. Document everything. Move quietly. Never underestimate a desperate man protecting power. Georgia plugged in an external hard drive she had not touched in years and began copying files methodically. Bank records, property documents, corporate statements, tax archives. The practical rhythm steadied her heartbeat. Outside the bedroom windows, morning sunlight spread across the manicured lawn like nothing catastrophic had happened. The world looked absurdly normal after betrayal. Her phone buzzed. Sam. Georgia answered immediately. How bad? Sam asked. Georgia sat slowly at the desk. Worse than we thought. She told her everything Jerome admitted that morning. The hidden apartment, the board, Walter contacting someone connected to the courts, the comments about emotional women, the shift in Jerome's behavior once he realized she found the agreements. Sam listened without interrupting. Then she said quietly, Good. Georgia blinked. Good. He's panicking. That doesn't feel good. It is legally. Georgia rubbed a hand over her forehead. I still can't believe this is happening. Yes, you can, Sam replied gently. The honesty of that answer stung, because deep down Georgia realized something painful. Part of her had known for a long time, not about Alyssa specifically, but about the rot underneath the marriage, the manipulation, the loneliness, the way Jerome slowly trained her to distrust her own instincts. Georgia stared toward the hallway. I feel stupid. No, Sam said sharply. You feel betrayed. Those are not the same thing. Silence settled briefly. Then Sam continued in a calmer tone. What's your next move? Georgia looked around the bedroom she once considered sacred. I don't know. Yes, you do. Georgia frowned slightly. Sam's voice softened. You start protecting yourself the way you protected him. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep, because Georgia had protected Jerome for years, protected his image, his moods, his ambitions, his ego. Even now, part of her still instinctively wanted to minimize damage for him. How horrifying. Start with logistics, Sam said. Passwords, accounts, storage, anything he could access. Georgia straightened slowly. Right. Action. Not grief. Not yet. Action. After the call ended, Georgia moved through the room with growing clarity. She changed passwords first. Email, cloud storage, banking apps, shared devices. Jerome's birthday stopped appearing everywhere in her life as the default security answer. Then she disabled fingerprint access on the home security app. For years, she managed the mansion's entire smart system because Jerome hated technical domestic nonsense. Georgia almost laughed remembering that phrase now. Women were invisible until their labor disappeared. Her laptop chimed softly. A notification appeared from one of Jerome's shared executive calendars. Dinner with investors. Charity gala next Thursday. Private golf meeting. His schedule continued like the universe had not split open. Georgia closed the window before rage could rise again. Focus. She opened another folder instead. Old architecture portfolios. For a moment, she simply stared. Hand sketches. Hotel concepts. Restaurant interiors. Creative notes written in her younger handwriting. Georgia had forgotten how talented she used to be, or maybe not forgotten, buried. A sudden memory surfaced, 31 years old, standing in an unfinished boutique hotel in Soho while contractors waited for her instructions. Confident, sharp, alive. A male developer once told her, "You walk into rooms like you own the building." Back then, she almost believed she could own her future. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Georgia hesitated before answering. Hello, silence. Then a quiet voice. It's Alyssa. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. Of course. I know you probably hate me, Alyssa rushed out, but please don't hang up. Georgia remained silent. In the background, she could hear faint baby noises, life continuing, messy and inconvenient and painfully real. "What do you want?" Georgia asked at last. Alyssa inhaled shakily. "I need to tell you something before Jerome gets to you first." Georgia's pulse slowed instantly. "What does that mean?" "He's already trying to control the story. Of course he was." Georgia leaned back slowly in the chair. "Alyssa, I know," Alyssa interrupted quickly. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now. But Jerome lied to both of us." Georgia's jaw tightened. "He told me your marriage was basically over," Alyssa whispered. "He said you stayed because of money and appearances." The words hurt more than Georgia expected, not because they were true, because Jerome had rewritten her into a villain to excuse his betrayal. Georgia stared out the window. "How long were you together?" A pause. 14 months. 14 months. Georgia felt physically cold. 14 months of lies layered over dinners and vacations and anniversaries. "How did you meet at a corporate fundraiser?" Georgia almost smiled bitterly. "Of course, one of the endless events she organized while Jerome hunted admiration in expensive rooms." Alyssa continued carefully. "He told me he was trapped, that you were emotionally distant." Georgia laughed softly. Emotionally distant. Interesting. She remembered begging Jerome to talk to her during those exact months, remembered sitting alone at charity dinners while Jerome disappeared to take calls, remembered crying quietly after he forgot their anniversary again. Men like Jerome always called women cold after freezing them out emotionally first. "I'm not calling to hurt you," Alyssa said suddenly. Georgia believed her. Oddly enough, that made everything sadder. "What do you want from me?" Georgia asked quietly. Another pause. Then Alyssa spoke in a smaller voice. "I'm scared." The honesty caught Georgia off guard. "He stopped answering my calls after the baby came. And after last night." Alyssa exhaled shakily. "I realized I don't actually know who he is." Georgia closed her eyes. For one dangerous second, she saw herself in the other woman. Not the affair, the confusion. The emotional manipulation. The slow realization that the man you trusted only loved control. Alyssa swallowed audibly. "There's more." Georgia opened her eyes again immediately. What more? He was planning something. Every nerve in Georgia's body sharpened. "What kind of something?" "I found emails." Georgia stood slowly. "What emails?" "About restructuring the company," Alyssa whispered, "and transferring assets before filing for divorce." The room tilted slightly. Georgia gripped the desk edge. "He was planning to leave you after the baby was born." There it was, the full truth, not a mistake, not an emotional affair that spiraled unexpectedly, a strategy, a timeline, an exit plan. Jerome had not been confused between two women. He had been preparing a replacement life. Georgia pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. Some part of her still hoped the betrayal had at least been chaotic, human, impulsive. But no, it had been organized. That somehow hurt most of all. Alyssa's voice cracked softly. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Georgia, I didn't know." Georgia believed that too. And strangely, she no longer had the energy to hate her. Hatred required emotional intimacy. Jerome had already consumed too much of that. What kind of emails? Georgia asked carefully. Financial stuff, legal drafts, mentions of trusts and asset protection. Georgia's heartbeat thundered. "Do you still have them?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Then Alyssa said quietly, "I'll give them to you." Georgia froze. "Why?" A bitter laugh escaped Alyssa. "Because I finally realized something last night." "What?" "He lied to me about you," Alyssa whispered. "Which means someday he'll lie to our daughter about me too." Georgia closed her eyes briefly. Their daughter. God. This child would grow up inside the wreckage Jerome created. A strange ache moved through her chest. Not forgiveness, but understanding. And understanding was sometimes more dangerous. Georgia looked at the sunlight flooding the bedroom floor. The same bedroom where she once begged Jerome to love her properly. Now she was preparing for war. Life changed quietly before it shattered loudly. "When can we meet?" Georgia asked. Alyssa exhaled shakily, almost relieved. "Whenever you want." Georgia glanced toward the closed bedroom door, toward the hallway where Jerome still moved somewhere downstairs inside the illusion of control. Then she spoke carefully. "Not here." The law office looked different in daylight, less cinematic, more dangerous. Georgia sat near the conference room windows watching Manhattan pulse beneath gray afternoon clouds, while Samantha Keller reviewed documents spread across the polished table. Across from Georgia sat Alyssa Monroe, the woman who had arrived at her front door holding a baby and the ruins of a marriage. Up close, Alyssa looked younger than Georgia first realized. Not childish, just tired. Exhausted in the specific way women looked when reality collapsed faster than denial could keep up. Her daughter slept in a stroller beside the conference table, wrapped in a pale pink blanket. Georgia had not expected the baby to be so small. That detail unsettled her more than it should have, because small things felt innocent, and nothing about this situation felt innocent anymore. Alyssa kept twisting a ring on her finger nervously. Not a wedding ring. Just anxiety searching for somewhere to go. Sam entered carrying coffee and a thick legal pad. "Okay," she said briskly. "Nobody lies in this room. We're past that stage." Georgia almost smiled faintly. Alyssa nodded quickly. Sam sat down and opened a folder. "Start from the beginning," she told Alyssa. Alyssa swallowed hard. "We met at a charity fundraiser 14 months ago." Georgia stared silently out the window. She remembered that fundraiser. Black dress. Diamond earrings Jerome bought after forgetting her birthday. 300 guests. Jerome disappearing repeatedly throughout the night to handle investor calls. God. He had probably been flirting with Alyssa while Georgia greeted donors downstairs. Alyssa continued shakily. "He told me he was separated emotionally from his wife." Georgia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emotionally separated. Interesting phrase. Men always created invisible divorces in their heads before physically betraying women. "He said the marriage became business," Alyssa whispered. "That you stayed together because of social expectations." Sam scribbled notes quickly. "Did he ever mention legal separation?" she asked. "No. Did he tell you he planned to divorce Georgia?" "Yes." Georgia finally looked directly at Alyssa. "Did you believe him?" The younger woman's eyes filled immediately. "Yes." The honesty disarmed Georgia more than excuses would have. Alyssa looked down at her hands. He sounded believable. Of course he did. Jerome Chapman built a career selling confidence to rooms full of wealthy strangers. Convincing women to trust him was probably effortless. Alyssa opened her purse slowly and pulled out her phone. "I brought everything." Sam leaned forward instantly. Emails, voice notes, flight confirmations, apartment records, photos. Georgia felt physically sick watching evidence of Jerome's second life accumulate across the conference table. There he was, in a Boston restaurant, smiling at Alyssa with the same crooked grin he once used on Georgia. There he was, assembling a crib. There he was sending texts at 2:14 a.m. while Georgia slept beside an empty pillow. Every image felt like another death. Sam remained clinical. "Forward all of this to the secure address I sent you." Alyssa nodded immediately. Georgia stared at one printed email in particular. Subject line, future planning. Jerome's words blurred slightly before sharpening again. "Once restructuring is complete, transition should be manageable." Transition. As though ending a marriage was simply moving assets between accounts. Georgia suddenly understood something horrifying. Jerome had already left emotionally long before Alyssa appeared. He simply forgot to tell his wife. Sam looked up from the documents. "These discussions about restructuring began 7 months ago." Georgia inhaled slowly. 7 months. That meant Jerome smiled through anniversary dinners while planning her replacement financially. Alyssa's voice trembled. "I didn't know he was moving money around. I swear." Georgia believed her, which somehow made the entire situation uglier, because Jerome had manipulated them differently. Georgia with emotional dependence, Alyssa with false promises. Two women standing in separate cages built by the same man. Sam opened another attachment. Then another. Her expression hardened visibly. "Well," she said quietly, "that's bad." George's pulse slowed instantly. What? Sam rotated the tablet toward them. An email thread. Jerome communicating with a private financial advisor. Georgia read silently. Need clean transition before announcement. Protect primary assets. Potential emotional response expected from spouse. Spouse. Not Georgia, just spouse. Like she was an obstacle inside paperwork. Alyssa pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. Oh my God. Georgia remained strangely calm. The pain was evolving now. Less like a knife, more like ice spreading slowly through her veins. Sam continued reading. Then she stopped abruptly. What Georgia asked. Sam's jaw tightened. He planned this carefully. Georgia gave a hollow laugh. Yes, I'm starting to notice. No. Sam looked directly at her. I mean legally. She tapped another message. Jerome had written, need narrative controlled before filing. Georgia tends toward emotional instability during conflict. The room went silent. Georgia stared at the words. Emotional instability. 12 years of loyalty reduced to a strategic liability. Alyssa looked horrified. He said that about you, Georgia almost smiled bitterly. Jerome likes women most when they're easy to manage. A strange expression crossed Alyssa's face then. Recognition. He used to say I was different from you, she admitted softly. Georgia looked at her. He said you were cold and difficult. He said I was supportive and easy to talk to. The irony nearly made Georgia laugh. Because once upon a time, Jerome said those exact things about her too. That realization settled heavily between them. Women were interchangeable to men like Jerome. Different faces, different phases, same emotional extraction. Sam broke the silence. Alyssa, did Jerome ever discuss Georgia directly after the baby was born? Alyssa hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. Georgia braced herself. He said Georgia would never leave him. The sentence hit harder than expected, not because it was cruel, because it was true. Jerome truly believed her love outweighed her self-respect. Alyssa swallowed hard. He said Georgia cared too much about appearances to destroy the marriage publicly. Georgia stared down at the conference table. Interesting. Jerome mistook grace for weakness. Alyssa's voice became smaller. He also said, she stopped. Say it, Sam instructed calmly. Alyssa looked ashamed. He said if things got ugly, he'd make sure people thought Georgia was unstable and vindictive. The air changed instantly. Georgia felt it. So did Sam. What exactly does that mean? Sam asked sharply. Alyssa reached for her phone again with trembling fingers. There's a voice memo. Georgia's stomach twisted. Alyssa pressed play. Jerome's voice filled the conference room. Smooth, controlled, dangerous. If Georgia reacts badly, it actually helps me. Emotional women always self-destruct publicly. I just need to stay calm. Georgia stopped breathing for one terrible second. Because suddenly she remembered every disagreement during their marriage. Every time Jerome stayed unnaturally composed while she cried. Every moment he subtly positioned himself as rational while she became emotional. It had not been maturity. It had been strategy. Sam immediately copied the recording into another file. This changes things, she said quietly. Georgia looked at her. How it establishes premeditated narrative manipulation. Georgia blinked slowly. Even legal language sounded sinister now. Alyssa turned the phone off. Tears slid silently down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. Georgia looked at her for a long moment. The younger woman looked broken, embarrassed, manipulated, used. Not victorious, not glamorous, just another casualty. Georgia suddenly felt exhausted by hatred, because Jerome was the center of the destruction, not the women orbiting around his lies. I don't forgive you, Georgia said honestly. Alyssa nodded immediately. I know, but I don't think you're my enemy either. That nearly made Alyssa cry harder. Sam watched both women carefully. You realize Jerome expected you two to hate each other, she said. Of course he did. Division protected men like him beautifully. Georgia looked down at the sleeping baby. Tiny fingers curled against the blanket. Completely innocent. What's her name? Georgia asked quietly. Alyssa blinked in surprise. Madeline. Georgia nodded slowly. Madeline. A real child. A real future. Not just evidence of betrayal. Something painful shifted inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just reality settling deeper. Sam closed the folder firmly. Here's what happens next. Both women looked at her. We move before Jerome realizes how much evidence exists. Georgia straightened slightly. Action. Good. Action felt safer than grief. Sam began organizing papers rapidly. Emergency financial protections, asset freezes, forensic review, potential fraud investigation. Georgia listened carefully, while Alyssa rocked the stroller gently beside them. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued moving beneath cold clouds and endless ambition. Inside the conference room, 3 women sat among the ruins Jerome Chapman thought he controlled. But for the first time since the affair exploded, Georgia realized something important. Jerome still believed he was the smartest person in the room. That would be his biggest mistake. Sam gathered the final stack of evidence into a secure folder. Then she looked directly at Georgia. We file before he can. Georgia nodded slowly, and somewhere deep inside, her grief began transforming into something far more dangerous. Resolve. Elaine Chapman called 2 days later. Georgia almost ignored it. She was sitting inside a temporary furnished apartment Sam helped her secure in Tribeca, surrounded by unopened boxes and silence that still felt unfamiliar. The apartment was smaller than the mansion, simpler, cleaner somehow. No marble staircase, no curated perfection, no Jerome. And despite the grief lodged permanently in her chest, Georgia had slept better there than she had in months. Her phone vibrated again. Elaine. Georgia answered on the 4th ring. Hello, Elaine's voice arrived, strained but polished. Georgia, sweetheart. Georgia nearly laughed at the word. Sweetheart. The Chapman family always became affectionate when they wanted something. What do you need, Elaine? A pause. We should talk. We already did. That wasn't a conversation. That was a disaster. Georgia walked toward the apartment windows overlooking the gray river. Yes, she said quietly. It was. Elaine inhaled sharply. Walter and I would like you to come for dinner tonight. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. Of course. The family summit. The damage control meeting. She could practically smell the expensive wine already. I don't think that's a good idea. Please. The word surprised her. Elaine Chapman rarely pleaded. We're family. Georgia looked down at the city below her. Funny how family became important only after betrayal threatened public image. Still, Sam's voice echoed in her mind. Never refuse information when people panic. Panicked people reveal things. What time? Georgia asked. Elaine sounded relieved instantly. 7. The Chapman estate looked immaculate that evening. Warm lights glowed through massive windows while luxury cars lined the circular driveway. From the outside, it still resembled the kind of family wealthy magazines admired. Successful, elegant, untouched. Georgia parked slowly and sat motionless for one extra moment before stepping out. The cold November air bit against her skin. For years, she entered this house as Jerome's wife. Tonight, she entered as a threat. Elaine greeted her personally at the door. The older woman wore cream silk and pearls perfectly composed, except for the tension around her eyes. Georgia, she said softly. Georgia noticed immediately Elaine tried to hug her. Interesting. Affection as negotiation again. Georgia stepped inside without returning it. The dining room had already been prepared. Walter sat at the far end of the table beside Jerome, and beside Walter sat another man Georgia recognized vaguely from charity galas, Martin Pierce, the Chapman family financial advisor. Of course, not a family dinner, an intervention. Jerome looked up as Georgia entered. For a brief second, his eyes softened with something almost genuine. Then Georgia remembered the voice memo. Emotional women always self-destruct publicly. The softness vanished from meaning entirely. Elaine motioned toward Georgia's chair. Thank you for coming. Georgia sat gracefully. I was curious. Nobody touched the food. Interesting again. This was never dinner. Walter folded his hands carefully. We all want the same thing here. Georgia almost smiled. Do we? Walter ignored that. We want to avoid unnecessary destruction. There it was. Not pain, not betrayal. Destruction. Always reputation first. Jerome finally spoke. You disappeared. Georgia looked at him calmly. I moved temporarily. You left without discussion. The audacity nearly impressed her. You had a child without discussion. Silence dropped instantly across the table. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. Martin Pierce shifted uncomfortably beside Walter. Good. Georgia wanted them uncomfortable. She had spent years swallowing discomfort politely, while everyone else remained protected from consequences. No more. Walter cleared his throat. Georgia emotions are understandably high right now. There's that word again, Georgia interrupted softly. Walter frowned. Emotions, no. Understandably. She looked around the table slowly. Everyone keeps talking like betrayal is unfortunate weather instead of deliberate choices. Jerome leaned back in his chair. You're turning this into theater. Georgia looked directly at him. No, Jerome. You did that when your mistress arrived holding your baby. Martin Pierce nearly choked on his water. Excellent. Elaine spoke quickly. Please. Public scenes help no one. Georgia's gaze shifted toward her mother-in-law. You mean public truth. Elaine's expression tightened. Georgia, you are not thinking long-term. Georgia almost laughed. The woman who sacrificed her own career for 12 years was apparently accused of lacking long-term thinking. Interesting. Walter leaned forward. You need to understand how ugly divorces become at this level. At this level. Wealthy people always treated suffering like a luxury problem. Georgia folded her hands calmly. And what level is that? Martin answered carefully this time. Media attention, investor anxiety, legal complications. Ah, there it was, not heartbreak. Business exposure. Jerome finally spoke with controlled patience. We can still resolve this privately. Georgia studied him carefully. Still handsome, still polished, still believing he controlled the room. You keep using the word privately, she said quietly. What you mean is quietly. His jaw tightened. Elaine quickly jumped in. You and Jerome built a beautiful life together. Georgia looked around the dining room slowly. Crystal chandeliers, imported wallpaper. Art selected by consultants. A mansion curated to impress strangers. Beautiful, but not peaceful, not honest, not safe. You know what's fascinating, Georgia said softly. I spent years convincing myself luxury meant happiness. Nobody answered. Because every person at the table had done the same thing. Walter finally pushed a document folder toward her. Jerome prepared something generous. Georgia stared at the folder. A settlement proposal. Of course. She opened it slowly. The numbers were large enough to impress ordinary people, not large enough to erase betrayal, and nowhere near what she legally deserved. Georgia turned another page. Non-disclosure clauses, asset limitations, public conduct expectations, restrictions regarding company communications. She looked up slowly. You invited me here to buy my silence. Jerome exhaled sharply. That's not what this is. Really? Georgia placed the folder back on the table carefully. Because it reads like you're paying premium rates for emotional suppression. Martin cleared his throat awkwardly. Elaine's voice sharpened slightly. Georgia, enough with the dramatics. There it was again. Dramatics. Women's pain always became dramatic once it inconvenienced powerful men. Georgia looked directly at Elaine. You knew. Elaine froze. You sat across from me at holidays knowing your son was building another family. Elaine's composure cracked slightly. We were trying to protect everyone. No, Georgia corrected quietly. You were protecting Jerome. Walter intervened immediately. This conversation is becoming unproductive. Georgia turned toward him. Then let's make it productive. She reached calmly into her purse and removed another folder. The atmosphere changed instantly. Jerome noticed first. What's that? Georgia slid the folder onto the table. Inside were copies. Financial transfers, Northline records, corporate amendments, the forged signature. Martin Pierce went pale almost immediately. Interesting, very interesting. Jerome's expression hardened. Where did you get those? Georgia ignored him. Instead, she looked directly at Martin. You're the financial advisor. Tell me something. Martin swallowed hard. What exactly? How serious is asset concealment during divorce proceedings? Nobody moved. Walter stared at Jerome slowly. Elaine looked genuinely frightened now. Jerome recovered first. This is ridiculous. Georgia almost smiled. No, she said softly. What's ridiculous is thinking I'd stay blind forever. Martin looked trapped. His professional instincts warred visibly against family loyalty. Finally, he spoke carefully. If these documents are legitimate, there could be significant legal exposure. Silence exploded through the room. Georgia watched Jerome carefully. There it was again. Fear. Real fear, this time. Not of losing her, of losing control. Jerome stood abruptly. You went through confidential company records. Georgia remained seated. I reviewed my own financial interests. You are not part of the company anymore. Georgia tilted her head slightly. That's strange. She pulled out one final paper, the original equity agreement, signed, dated, legally binding. I seem very included here. Jerome's face drained of color. Walter grabbed the document quickly. Elaine whispered, Jerome. For the first time all evening, nobody looked at Georgia like she was emotional. Now they looked at her like she was dangerous. Good. Georgia rose slowly from her chair. I spent years shrinking myself to make this family comfortable, she said quietly. That ends now. Jerome stepped toward her immediately. You're making a mistake. Georgia looked directly into his eyes. No, she replied softly. I think marrying a man who mistook loyalty for weakness was the mistake. Then her phone buzzed inside her purse. She glanced down. Mark Ellison, CFO Chapman and Vale. Interesting timing. Georgia answered calmly. Hello. Mark's voice sounded strained. Georgia, the board is calling an emergency meeting. Georgia slowly lifted her eyes toward Jerome. For the first time since she met him, Jerome Chapman looked completely unprepared. Jerome barely spoke during the drive to Manhattan the next morning. Georgia noticed because Jerome always spoke. He narrated rooms, controlled conversations, filled silence before anyone else could shape it. Now he sat beside the window of the black SUV staring at his phone while the city rushed past beneath cold November skies. For the first time in 12 years, he looked uncertain. Good. Georgia sat across from him in silence. Sam sat beside her reviewing documents on a tablet with terrifying calm. The emergency board meeting had been called for 9:30. Mandatory attendance. No delays, no excuses. Apparently, Mark Ellison had already informed the board. There were serious concerns regarding financial conduct. Georgia almost smiled, remembering Jerome's face at dinner the night before. Shock looked ugly on powerful men. Jerome finally broke the silence. You're enjoying this. Georgia looked up slowly. No. His jaw tightened. You wanted to humiliate me. Interesting. Men like Jerome always called consequences humiliation, as though exposure was more offensive than betrayal itself. Georgia folded her hands carefully. You humiliated yourself the moment you started living a double life. Sam didn't even glance up from her tablet. I strongly recommend neither of you speak unless legally necessary. Jerome shot her a cold look. You're turning my wife against me. Sam finally looked up then. No, she said calmly. You did that yourself. Silence returned. Outside Manhattan rose around them in steel and glass. Chapman and Vale Consulting occupied the top floors of a luxury corporate tower overlooking the Hudson. Georgia remembered helping Jerome choose the office 15 years earlier. You need views, she told him back then. Powerful people pay more when they feel elevated. Funny. Now Jerome looked like a man being marched toward execution inside the building he once worshipped. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt suffocatingly quiet. When the doors opened, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Employees avoided eye contact. Assistants whispered near reception desks. Someone abruptly stopped talking when Jerome walked past. Scandal moved fast in corporate America. Fear moved faster. Georgia stepped out beside Sam calmly, while Jerome walked ahead too quickly, pretending confidence he no longer possessed. The executive conference room doors were already open. Board members filled the long glass table inside, older men in expensive suits, sharp-eyed women with tablets open, legal advisors, financial consultants, and at the far end Mark Ellison. The CFO looked like he hadn't slept in days. Good. Maybe guilt was finally expensive too. Conversations died the moment Jerome entered. The room became unnaturally still. Jerome immediately switched into performance mode. Controlled posture, calm expression, executive voice. Thank you all for coming on short notice. Georgia almost admired the discipline. Even cornered Jerome still tried to lead the room. But then one of the board members interrupted sharply. No, Jerome said, Evelyn Ross, Senior Board Director. You don't lead this meeting. The shift in power was immediate. Jerome froze for half a second. Enough for everyone to notice. Georgia quietly took her seat beside Sam. Several people looked surprised to see her. Of course they were. For years, Jerome minimized her publicly into decorative background. Now she arrived with legal counsel and evidence. Interesting transformation. Evelyn folded her hands. Mr. Ellison brought several concerns to the board's attention involving unauthorized financial activity and potential governance violations. Jerome immediately straightened. This is a misunderstanding. Mark looked physically ill. Georgia studied him carefully. He wasn't loyal to Jerome anymore. He was loyal to survival. That mattered more. Sam calmly slid several folders across the table. Before this proceeds, she said professionally, we'd like the board to review documentation related to Georgia Chapman's founding equity position in Chapman and Vail Consulting. The room shifted instantly. Several heads lifted sharply. One board member frowned. Founding equity. Jerome spoke too quickly. That agreement is outdated. Sam ignored him. Legally, it is active. Georgia watched the confusion spread around the table, because most of these people truly did not know. Jerome spent years carefully rewriting company history until he appeared self-made. Women's labor disappeared quietly inside successful marriages all the time. Sam opened the original formation documents. Initial capital contributions, silent equity allocations, protective clauses, Jerome's signature, Georgia's signature. One board member adjusted his glasses slowly. This is legitimate, yes, Sam replied. Mark spoke quietly for the first time. Our legal department verified the original filings this morning. Jerome turned toward him sharply. You verified documents without consulting me, Mark finally snapped. Consulting you is exactly how we got here. Silence exploded across the room. Georgia almost felt sorry for Mark. Almost. Jerome's expression darkened dangerously. You're protecting yourself. Mark laughed bitterly. You think Evelyn raised a hand sharply. Enough. She looked toward Georgia directly. Mrs. Chapman. Were you actively involved in the formation of the company? Georgia held her gaze calmly. Yes. Not emotional, not dramatic, just factual. The room listened differently already. Georgia continued. I funded the original office using inheritance money from my mother's estate. I also handled early branding, investor hospitality, spatial design, client preparation, and operational support during the company's first 3 years. Several board members exchanged looks. Jerome interrupted coldly. She hosted dinners. Georgia looked at him. And built investor trust while you chased meetings. That landed harder than shouting would have, because everyone in that room understood how much relationships mattered in business. Sam slid another folder across the table. Additionally, we have evidence suggesting misuse of corporate funds through shell vendor payments tied to residential property support. Jerome immediately stood. This is absurd. Sam remained calm. Northline Strategy Services. Jerome's silence answered everything. Mark closed his eyes briefly like a man watching disaster become inevitable. One board member frowned deeply while reviewing statements. These payments were categorized as consulting retention. Georgia watched Jerome carefully. Still no apology, still no shame, only strategy failing in real time. Jerome looked toward the board. This is personal retaliation. Interesting. Men always called truth retaliation when women finally documented it. Sam opened another file. Then perhaps you can explain these emails discussing asset protection before planned marital dissolution. The room became deadly quiet. Jerome stared at the papers. Georgia almost heard the exact moment panic entered his bloodstream. He recovered quickly. Too quickly. These emails are being misinterpreted. Sam's expression didn't change. Are the emails authentic? Jerome hesitated. Fatal mistake, Evelyn noticed immediately. So they are authentic, Jerome inhaled sharply. Private marital matters should not be discussed in a corporate governance meeting. Mark suddenly laughed once, harshly. You charged your mistress's apartment to the company. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Georgia stayed completely still. That unsettled people more than rage would have, because calm women frightened powerful men, especially calm women carrying receipts. Evelyn finally restored order. "Mr. Chapman," she said coldly. "Did you authorize false expense classifications?" Jerome's mask cracked then. "Not fully, but enough. You're all overreacting." There it was. The arrogance. The belief that consequences only existed for ordinary people. Georgia realized something fascinating in that moment. Jerome truly never expected accountability. Not from his family, not from his marriage, not from his company. Success insulated him so thoroughly, he mistook immunity for superiority. Sam quietly placed one final document onto the table. The forged signature. Several board members immediately leaned closer. Evelyn's face hardened. "Is this Mrs. Chapman's authentic signature?" Georgia answered before Jerome could. "No." Jerome looked at her sharply. "You can't prove that." Sam folded her hands. "We already retained a forensic handwriting specialist." Silence. Jerome finally looked afraid. Real fear this time. Not irritation, not inconvenience. Fear. And suddenly Georgia understood something deeply satisfying. The man who spent years making her feel powerless had built his entire empire assuming she would remain small forever. He underestimated her because loving women quietly often looked identical to weakness. Evelyn stood slowly. "The board will be initiating an independent investigation, effective immediately." Jerome stared at her. "You can't be serious." "Oh, we're very serious." Another board member spoke next. "Pending review, we are placing temporary restrictions on executive financial authority." Jerome's face drained of color. "You're suspending me." Evelyn held his gaze. "We are protecting the company." Interesting. That phrase again. Protection. Only now Jerome stood outside of it. Mark finally spoke quietly. "There's more." Every head turned toward him. Mark swallowed hard. "We discovered additional undeclared accounts this morning." Jerome closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The moment he realized the collapse had moved beyond his control. Georgia watched him carefully. For years, she feared this man, loved him, protected him. Now he simply looked smaller than his own reputation. Evelyn turned toward Georgia again. "To stabilize investor confidence, we would like you to remain available as an advisory presence during the investigation." Jerome's head snapped toward her instantly. Shock flashed openly across his face. Georgia almost smiled, not because she wanted power, because Jerome finally understood something devastating. The woman he reduced to emotional background noise still had influence in the rooms he cared about most. And suddenly she wasn't invisible anymore. Jerome came to the apartment that night. Georgia knew he would before the doorman even called upstairs. Men like Jerome could not tolerate losing control quietly, especially not after humiliation. The board meeting ended 6 hours earlier, but the shock still lingered inside her body like electrical static beneath skin. Temporary executive restrictions. Independent investigation. Frozen discretionary authority. Every headline Jerome once weaponized against competitors now hovered dangerously close to him. Georgia stood inside the kitchen, staring at the city lights outside her apartment windows, when the intercom buzzed. "Ms. Chapman," the doorman said carefully, "your husband is here. Not Jerome. Your husband." Funny how titles survived long after trust died. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. "Send him up." Sam would hate that decision, but part of Georgia needed to see him now. Not the executive, not the polished speaker in tailored suits, the real version underneath collapse. 10 minutes later, a hard knock echoed through the apartment. Georgia opened the door slowly. Jerome looked terrible, not physically ruined, still handsome, still expensive. But the polish had cracked. His tie hung loose, his eyes were bloodshot, and for the first time since she met him, Jerome Chapman looked like a man afraid of the future. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. Old habits. Georgia closed the door quietly behind him. Neither spoke immediately. The apartment suddenly felt too small for 12 years of damage. Jerome walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. "You blindsided me." Georgia almost laughed. "You had a child with another woman. That's not what I'm talking about." "Of course it wasn't. Because Jerome still categorized betrayal differently depending on who suffered from it. Georgia leaned against the kitchen counter. "What do you want?" Jerome turned toward her sharply. "What do I want?" he repeated. "My company is under investigation." "Interesting. Still my company, even now." Georgia crossed her arms slowly. "You forged legal documents. You can't prove that. We both know I can." Jerome looked away immediately. There it was again. Avoidance, not innocence. He grabbed a glass from the kitchen shelf without asking and poured himself water. His hands trembled slightly. Good. Georgia wanted him uncomfortable, wanted him to feel one fraction of the instability he planted inside her life. Jerome drank half the glass before speaking again. "You humiliated me in front of the board." Georgia stared at him in disbelief. "That's your concern. You made me look corrupt." "No," she said quietly. "Your actions did that." Jerome slammed the glass down harder than necessary. "You think this is justice?" he snapped. "You think destroying everything we built makes you strong?" Georgia's pulse slowed dangerously. Everything we built. Interesting how ownership became shared again only during collapse. She stepped closer carefully. "You built a second family while planning how to erase me financially." Jerome rubbed both hands over his face. "I was going to take care of you." The sentence landed like poison. Take care of her. Like she was an obligation, a dependent, a pet. Georgia laughed softly, not kindly. Jerome looked up sharply. "What's funny? You still think money is the same thing as love." His jaw tightened immediately. "You lived very comfortably loving me." There it was, the cruelty beneath panic. Georgia felt it cut through her chest, not because it was true, because she once feared it might be. For years, Jerome subtly trained her to feel guilty for benefiting from the life they built together, as though her sacrifices were less valuable because they happened privately. Georgia straightened slowly. "I earned every inch of that life," Jerome scoffed. "Doing what hosting dinners." The words hit harder this time, not because they were new, because Jerome finally stopped hiding his contempt. Georgia stared at him carefully. "You really believe I contributed nothing?" "I believe you were my wife." No, he believed she was infrastructure, invisible when functioning correctly, only noticed when gone. Georgia moved toward the window slowly. Below them, Manhattan glowed in restless gold beneath the dark sky. She remembered standing beside Jerome years ago on another rooftop overlooking the city. He held her face gently and whispered, "One day we'll own this town." Back then it sounded romantic. Now she understood. Jerome never loved partnership. He loved conquest, and wives were simply safer trophies than equals. "You know what the worst part is?" Georgia asked quietly. Jerome looked exhausted. "What I would have stayed." Silence. Real silence this time. Georgia turned toward him slowly. "If you had come to me honestly before all this, if you told me you were unhappy, I would have fought for us." Jerome's expression flickered unexpectedly. Regret. Maybe. Or maybe only surprise that she still admitted loving him. Georgia shook her head slightly. "But you didn't want honesty. You wanted convenience." Jerome's face hardened again. "You act like I'm some monster. You manipulated two women simultaneously while planning financial protection strategies behind both their backs. That's business." The room went still. Because he meant it. Jerome genuinely viewed emotional destruction through the same lens as negotiation, optimization, risk management. Georgia suddenly felt deeply tired, not angry, just tired. Jerome walked toward her again carefully. "Georgia," he said more softly now, "listen to me." His voice changed, warmer, intimate, the old Jerome, the version that used tenderness strategically. "I made mistakes, always that word, never betrayal, never cruelty, never abuse." Georgia remained silent. Jerome stepped closer. "I panicked. About what losing everything." Georgia held his gaze. "You mean losing control?" Something dangerous flickered across his face then. Brief, dark, gone too fast for most people to notice. But Georgia noticed now. She noticed everything now. Jerome lowered his voice further. "You think these people care about you?" he asked. "The board Sam Keller investors." Georgia said nothing. They're using you against me. Interesting. Jerome still could not imagine women acting independently unless manipulated by others. They respect evidence, Georgia replied calmly. They respect scandal. No, they fear liability. That irritated him more, because she understood his world now. Jerome stepped even closer. Do you know what happens to women after public divorces like this? Georgia almost smiled. They survive. You become gossip. I already became collateral inside your ego. Gossip sounds manageable. His composure cracked. You're being vindictive. Georgia stared at him. Vindictive would have been exposing everything publicly already. That landed. Jerome's nostrils flared slightly. For one terrible second, Georgia saw genuine hatred beneath his panic. Not loud hatred. Worse. The cold resentment powerful men felt when women stopped obeying quietly. You've changed, he said. Georgia nodded slowly. Yes. His eyes searched her face desperately. Georgia, please. The word sounded unfamiliar on him. Please required humility. Jerome rarely practiced that emotion. He reached toward her instinctively. Georgia stepped back immediately. The movement stunned him. For years he touched her, whenever he wanted comfort, forgiveness, reassurance. Now there was space between them. Chosen space. Jerome stared at her like he finally understood the distance was real. I still love you, he said quietly. Georgia's heart twisted painfully, because part of her wished she could believe him. But love without respect was just emotional possession, and she finally understood the difference. You loved being loved by me, she whispered. Jerome looked wounded by that. Good. Truth should wound. His voice sharpened suddenly. So that's it. You destroy my career and walk away. Georgia frowned slightly. Destroy. Again. Consequences always sounded like destruction when powerful men experienced them personally. I didn't destroy your career, she said calmly. I stopped protecting it from your choices. Jerome's breathing grew heavier. Then suddenly, crash. His arm swept violently across the kitchen counter. A crystal vase shattered against the floor. Georgia flinched backward instinctively. Silence exploded between them. Jerome froze too. His chest rose and fell rapidly. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Then Georgia realized something cold and terrifying. She was no longer emotionally unsafe around Jerome. She might be physically unsafe too. Jerome looked at the broken glass, then at her. His voice became instantly softer again. Georgia, no. The word came fast, sharp, clear. Georgia stepped backward slowly. No. Something changed in Jerome's expression then, because he heard it too. Not anger, not fear, finality. Georgia grabbed her phone from the counter without taking her eyes off him. I think you should leave. Jerome stared at her. You'd call security on me, if necessary. His face twisted slightly. Disbelief, insult, rage. Because powerful men always looked shocked when women finally chose boundaries over loyalty. Jerome grabbed his coat harshly. This isn't over. Georgia held his gaze steadily. Yes, she said quietly. It is. He walked out without another word. The apartment door slammed behind him hard enough to shake the walls. Silence flooded the room afterward. Georgia stood motionless, beside the shattered glass, her entire body trembling now, not because she missed him, because she finally understood something horrifying. Jerome Chapman was never most dangerous when he was angry. He was most dangerous when he felt powerless. And tonight, for the first time in his life, he did. The first article appeared online at 6:42 the next morning. Georgia saw it while standing barefoot in her kitchen, holding untouched coffee. Chapman and Vale, CEO, under internal investigation. The headline sat on her phone screen, glowing cold and sharp beneath the morning light. She stared at it for a long moment. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just inevitability. Because secrets built on arrogance always collapse loudly eventually. Her phone buzzed relentlessly after that. Unknown numbers, friends, former colleagues, social acquaintances pretending concern while hunting details. Georgia silenced almost all of them. She had no energy left for spectators. Another headline appeared an hour later. Sources suggest financial misconduct linked to executive personal expenses. Then another. Corporate golden couple facing public fallout. Georgia nearly laughed at that one. Golden couple, as though polished photographs ever revealed truth. The apartment suddenly felt too small beneath the weight of public exposure. For years, Jerome carefully curated their image, the perfect marriage, the elegant home, the charity galas, the effortless success. Now strangers dissected the ruins over coffee and social media threads. Funny how quickly admiration transformed into entertainment. Her phone rang again. Sam. Georgia answered immediately. It's escalating fast, Sam said without greeting. I noticed. How are you holding up? Georgia looked out the window toward the river. I honestly don't know. That was the truth. Some moments she felt devastatingly sad. Other moments she felt eerily calm. And underneath everything else was something newer. Relief. Tiny. Terrifying. But real. Relief that she no longer had to perform happiness beside a man destroying her privately. Sam's voice sharpened slightly. Listen carefully. Jerome's PR people are already working damage control. Of course they were. Jerome would rather restructure reality than face it honestly. What are they saying? A pause. They're floating narratives about marital instability. Georgia closed her eyes. There it was. Exactly like the voice memo. Emotional instability. Difficult marriage. Vindictive wife. Predictable. They're implying you became aggressive after discovering the affair. Georgia almost smiled bitterly. Interesting how women became aggressive the moment they stopped quietly accepting humiliation. Sam continued, I need to know if Jerome has any recordings, texts, emails, anything he could manipulate. Georgia thought carefully. No. Good. Because he's preparing for reputational warfare now. War. The word no longer sounded dramatic, only accurate. Georgia leaned against the counter slowly. What do we do? We stay disciplined, Sam replied immediately. No emotional interviews, no public statements except through legal counsel. Georgia nodded instinctively before remembering Sam couldn't see her. Okay. And Georgia. Yes. Do not underestimate how ugly this gets once powerful men feel cornered. The line went silent after the call ended. Georgia stared down at her reflection in the black phone screen. Powerful men? Funny. Jerome never looked dangerous during their marriage. He looked charming, successful, protective. That was the problem with emotional manipulation. It rarely arrived looking violent. It arrived looking sophisticated. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Alyssa. Georgia hesitated before answering. Hi. Alyssa sounded exhausted already. There are photographers outside my apartment. Georgia's stomach tightened immediately. What, they found out where I live? Baby noises cried faintly in the background. Panic rose instantly inside Georgia's chest. Not for Jerome, for the child. Did Jerome send them? I don't know. But they both suspected he probably leaked enough information indirectly for attention to shift away from himself. Georgia sat down slowly at the kitchen island. Are you safe? Alyssa laughed weakly. I don't even know what that means anymore. Georgia understood that feeling completely. Alyssa exhaled shakily. He texted me last night. Georgia's pulse slowed instantly. What did he say? He told me not to talk to anyone else. He said lawyers would handle everything. Of course. Containment again. Control again. Women repositioned like liabilities. And Georgia asked carefully. A long pause. Georgia. I think he hates me now. The sentence settled heavily between them, not because it surprised Georgia, because it didn't. Men like Jerome adored women most before consequences attached themselves. Then affection curdled into resentment frighteningly fast. What exactly did he say? Georgia asked quietly. Alyssa's voice trembled. He said I ruined his life. Georgia closed her eyes. Interesting. Jerome cheated. Jerome lied. Jerome manipulated. But somehow the women ruined his life. The narcissism would almost be fascinating if it weren't so destructive. You didn't ruin his life, Georgia said softly. He says I trapped him. Georgia laughed once. Sharp. Cold. Jerome Chapman trapped himself. Silence. Then Alyssa whispered, I'm sorry. Georgia looked out across the apartment again. For weeks she imagined hating Alyssa forever. But now the hatred felt exhausting, too simple, because the real devastation came from Jerome constructing two separate emotional realities simultaneously. I know, Georgia said quietly, and strangely, she meant it. 3 hours later, Sam arrived at the apartment carrying folders and takeout containers. "You need protein," she announced immediately. Georgia almost smiled faintly. "Is that legal strategy?" "Yes." Starving clients cried too much. They sat together at the dining table reviewing media coverage. Georgia hated seeing herself discussed publicly by strangers. Photos from charity events, wedding pictures, articles analyzing her facial expressions like emotional forensic evidence. One article described her as coldly composed. Georgia stared at the phrase for a long moment. Coldly composed. Interesting. If she cried publicly, she'd be unstable. If she stayed calm, she became cold. Women truly could not win once people wanted spectacle from their pain. Sam handed her another document. "We're releasing a statement." Georgia read it carefully. Simple, elegant, professional. No mudslinging, no emotional collapse, just boundaries. She should not comment publicly on the child or Ms. Monroe, Sam added. Georgia nodded immediately. Of course not. Sam studied her for a moment. "You know, most people in your position would be trying to destroy Alyssa publicly." Georgia looked down at the paper. "I thought about it." But Georgia inhaled slowly. She already lost whatever fantasy Jerome sold her. That was punishment enough. Sam leaned back slightly. "That restraint will matter later." Georgia frowned faintly. "What do you mean? People notice dignity." Georgia almost laughed. Dignity. What an exhausting thing women were expected to maintain while bleeding emotionally. Still, Sam was right. Jerome expected chaos, expected screaming interviews, expected emotional collapse. Instead, Georgia gave him silence and documentation, and somehow that frightened him more. Another notification appeared on Georgia's phone, this time from an unknown former employee at Chapman and Vale. "You don't know me personally, but I think you deserve to know Jerome isn't who people think he is." Georgia's stomach tightened. More messages followed throughout the afternoon. Former assistants, junior executives, administrative staff, small stories, cruel comments, manipulations, expense irregularities, patterns, always patterns. Jerome apparently spent years believing charm erased accountability. Now people finally felt safe enough to speak. By evening, another article dropped online. Former employees raised questions about Chapman leadership culture. Georgia stared at the headline quietly. The empire was cracking now, not because she destroyed it, because it had always been rotting underneath. Sam closed her laptop slowly. "He's losing narrative control." Georgia looked exhausted suddenly. "Why doesn't that feel good?" Sam's expression softened slightly. "Because you loved him." There it was, the ugly truth beneath everything else. Georgia still mourned the man she thought Jerome was, even while learning that version never truly existed. The apartment fell quiet for a while. Outside Manhattan glowed beneath early evening rain. Finally, Sam spoke again. "There's one more thing." Georgia looked up. "We found evidence Jerome may have started moving assets months before the affair surfaced." Georgia's stomach dropped instantly. "How a former assistant contacted us." Georgia straightened slightly. "What assistant?" Sam slid over another folder. "Natalie Brooks." The name sounded vaguely familiar. "She worked directly under Jerome for 3 years," Sam explained. "And apparently she kept copies of certain financial communications." Georgia stared at the folder slowly. More evidence, more lies, more proof Jerome planned everything carefully. Sam looked directly at her. "Georgia," she said quietly, "we are no longer negotiating from pain." Georgia swallowed hard. "We're negotiating from power now." And for the first time since Alyssa knocked on her front door, Georgia finally believed it. The mediation office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Central Park. Everything inside looked designed to suppress emotion. Neutral cream walls, soft lighting, expensive silence. Even the coffee tasted emotionally unavailable. Georgia sat beside Sam Keller at the long conference table while rain streaked slowly down the windows behind them. Across the room, Jerome had not arrived yet. Good. Georgia needed the extra minutes to steady herself. Not because she feared him anymore, because endings carried their own kind of grief. Sam reviewed documents one final time: asset division proposals, corporate settlement terms, protective clauses, forensic findings. The stack of evidence had grown so large it no longer looked like heartbreak. It looked like architecture, an entire hidden system built carefully behind her back. Sam glanced sideways at her. "How are you feeling?" Georgia considered the question honestly. "Tired." "That's normal." "No," Georgia said quietly. "I mean tired in my bones." Sam's expression softened slightly. "Yes," she said. "That's normal too." The conference room door opened then. Jerome walked in with his attorney. And for one strange second, Georgia barely recognized him. Not because he looked physically different, because the aura was gone. Jerome Chapman built his identity around certainty, power, control, admiration. Now he walked like a man trying to outrun collapse with expensive shoes. He still wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, still looked handsome enough for magazine covers, but the performance no longer worked on Georgia. That was the difference. Jerome froze briefly when he saw her. His eyes moved over her carefully. Georgia wore cream silk and black trousers, her hair pulled neatly back, her expression composed. No trembling, no tears, no desperation. Something unreadable crossed Jerome's face. Maybe anger, maybe regret, maybe the horrifying realization that she no longer looked emotionally reachable. He sat across from her slowly. Neither spoke at first. The mediators entered. Introductions were made. Rules established. Professional voices filled the room while Georgia stared quietly at the man she once rearranged her entire life around. Funny how strangers could wear familiar faces. The mediation began with finances, properties, investment structures, corporate exposure. Jerome's attorney tried to sound confident. Georgia almost admired the effort, until Sam began speaking. Then the room changed. Calmly, precisely, ruthlessly. Sam presented evidence, one layer at a time. The original equity agreement, the forged signature concerns, hidden accounts, Northline strategy payments, asset transfer planning, voice recordings, Natalie Brooks documentation. Each piece landed like another crack, spreading through Jerome's carefully polished image. Georgia watched him closely throughout. At first, Jerome still tried to maintain executive composure, hands folded, voice measured, controlled breathing. But then Sam placed the forensic handwriting analysis onto the table, and Jerome finally looked afraid again. His attorney leaned toward him immediately, whispering something urgent. Georgia didn't need to hear it. She already understood. Settle. That's what they were saying. Settle before this becomes catastrophic. Jerome suddenly looked at Georgia directly. This is excessive. Georgia held his gaze calmly. So was building a second life while planning my financial erasure. His jaw tightened. You're enjoying punishing me. Interesting. Men like Jerome always interpreted accountability emotionally once consequences arrived. Georgia leaned back slightly. No, she said softly. I'm protecting myself. That landed harder, because Jerome truly never expected her to prioritize herself over him. The mediator cleared his throat carefully. Perhaps we should focus on practical resolution. Yes, practical. Georgia almost smiled at the irony. Women's pain always became inconvenient once paperwork started. Jerome's attorney slid a revised settlement proposal across the table. Significantly larger now. Of course. Fear made men generous, faster than love ever did. Georgia reviewed it quietly. Properties, liquid assets, corporate equity, spousal terms. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What is this? Sam leaned closer immediately. A mansion retention clause. Jerome wanted to keep the house. Interesting. Georgia slowly looked up. You're offering me everything except the property. Jerome's voice remained calm. It makes sense for me to retain the residence. Georgia almost laughed. The residence. Funny. That house had absorbed 12 years of her emotional labor. Every dinner, every holiday, every curated detail. and now Jerome wanted to preserve it like a museum dedicated to his former power. "You can't afford it anymore," Sam said flatly. Jerome's expression hardened. "That's not your concern. It becomes my concern when hidden accounts funded your affair apartment." Silence. Georgia stared down at the mansion clause again. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, she realized something. She didn't want the house, not because it lacked value, because it no longer felt like home. It felt like performance, a beautiful prison filled with polished loneliness. Georgia slowly closed the document. "I don't want the mansion." Jerome blinked immediately. The attorneys looked surprised too. Sam glanced sideways at her carefully, but remained silent. Jerome frowned. "You don't." Georgia shook her head slowly. "I want it sold." That landed harder than any demand so far, because Jerome loved that house, not emotionally. Symbolically, it represented success, status, power. Georgia looked directly at him. "I spent years trying to turn that place into a home," she said quietly. "But it was always just a stage where I played supportive wife while you built yourself into the center of every room." Jerome stared at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not manipulation this time. Something sadder. Recognition. Too late recognition. "You love that house," he said quietly. Georgia smiled faintly. "No, I loved who I thought we were inside it." The room went silent. Even the mediator stopped speaking for a moment, because grief sounded different when it was finally honest. Jerome looked down at the settlement papers. For the first time all day, he seemed less angry than exhausted. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. Georgia almost pitied him. Almost. But then she remembered the emails, the planning, the manipulation, the way he called her emotional instability inside legal strategy discussions. "You prepared for divorce months before I even knew about Alyssa." Georgia replied calmly. "You absolutely wanted this. You just wanted it on your terms." His face tightened painfully. The truth looked ugly on him. Sam slid another document across the table. Child support structures for Madeline. Georgia noticed Jerome barely looked at it. That hurt in ways she couldn't explain. Not for herself. For the child. A daughter born into emotional wreckage created by a father obsessed with image. The mediator resumed discussions carefully. Hours passed. Numbers changed. Terms shifted. Protective orders strengthened. Corporate disclosures finalized. And slowly, inevitably, Jerome lost. Not loudly, not dramatically, just mathematically. By evening, the final documents sat ready. Jerome stared at them for a very long time before signing. Georgia watched his hand carefully. Still steady. Interesting. Even now, he refused visible collapse. After he finished, he slid the papers across the table toward her. Georgia signed next. Her hand trembled only once. Not from doubt, from mourning. Because no matter how justified the ending was, some part of her still grieved the life she once believed in. The mediator gathered the completed documents carefully. "It's done," he said quietly. Done. Such a small word for the death of 12 years. Everyone slowly began packing materials away, but before anyone could stand, Jerome suddenly spoke. "Can we have a minute?" Sam immediately looked at Georgia. "Your choice." Georgia inhaled slowly, then nodded once. The room emptied gradually until only she and Jerome remained. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The city glowed beneath them. Jerome loosened his tie slightly. For the first time all day, he looked genuinely human instead of strategic. "You really hate me now," he said quietly. Georgia looked at him for a long moment. "No," she answered honestly. That surprised him. Then what Georgia considered the question carefully. Finally, she said softly, "I think I finally see you clearly." Something inside Jerome visibly broke at that, because hatred still contained emotional attachment. Clarity did not. He looked away toward the rain-covered windows. "You've become hard." Georgia almost smiled sadly. "No," she whispered. "I just stopped being soft enough for people to cut pieces out of me." Silence filled the room one last time. Then Georgia stood slowly. She picked up her coat and walked away from the marriage without looking back. Peace felt unfamiliar at first. That surprised Georgia more than the divorce itself. For years, she believed peace would arrive dramatically, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, like movie endings where music swelled and pain disappeared all at once. Instead, healing arrived quietly, slowly, in ordinary moments. 3 months after the settlement, Georgia stood barefoot in her new apartment, watering a small olive tree beside the windows, while jazz played softly from the kitchen speaker. No shouting, no tension, no waiting for Jerome's mood to decide the atmosphere of the room. Just silence, safe silence. The apartment looked nothing like the mansion, and Georgia loved it for that reason. Warm wood floors, cream linen curtains, books stacked carelessly instead of styled by interior consultants. Sketches scattered across the dining table, natural light everywhere. The space finally looked like a woman lived there instead of a corporate brand. Her phone buzzed softly. Rebecca Lane. Georgia smiled immediately before answering. "You're late," Rebecca announced dramatically. Georgia laughed. "I'm literally opening the studio in 10 minutes. Exactly, which means you should already be panicking." The laugh came easier these days. Not constantly, but genuinely. That mattered. An hour later, Georgia stood inside her new design studio watching morning sunlight spill across polished concrete floors and unfinished display walls. GC Design House. Her name, only hers. No Chapman and Vale, no Jerome, no invisible labor hiding behind someone else's legacy. Rebecca appeared carrying coffee and a box of pastries. "You look terrifyingly competent," she announced. Georgia accepted the coffee with a grin. "I missed you too." Rebecca had been one of the first people to call after the scandal exploded publicly. Not for gossip, for Georgia. That distinction mattered more now than it used to. The studio itself wasn't enormous, but it was beautiful, intentional, alive. Mood boards lined the walls. Fabric samples covered long tables. Architectural sketches waited beneath warm lamps. For the first time in years, Georgia's creativity belonged fully to her again. No one interrupted it. No one minimized it. No one called it decorative support work. Rebecca watched her quietly for a moment. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't seen you look this awake since your early 30s. Georgia looked around the studio slowly. Neither had she. Their first major project occupied half the back wall already. A women's recovery center, not luxury condos, not executive offices, a real healing space. Georgia ran her fingers lightly across the design sketches. Soft, natural lighting. Private therapy gardens. Safe communal spaces. Rooms designed to feel emotionally breathable. The project felt personal in ways she still struggled to explain. "Funny," Rebecca said while opening pastry boxes, "you spent years helping rich men feel powerful." Georgia smiled faintly. "And now you're building something that actually matters." The words stayed with her all afternoon, because they were true. Somewhere along the way, Georgia stopped measuring success through proximity to powerful men. Now success looked like peace, autonomy, breathing without fear. Later that evening, Georgia received an unexpected message. Elaine Chapman. Georgia stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it. Not a text, a handwritten letter, photographed carefully. Interesting. Elaine valued appearances too much for casual vulnerability. Georgia read slowly. Georgia. I spent years protecting my son because I believed protecting him protected the family. I understand now that all we really protected was his ability to avoid consequences. Georgia swallowed hard. The letter continued. You deserve better from all of us, especially from me. No excuses, no justifications. That almost hurt more. Georgia sat quietly on the couch, staring at the message long after finishing it. Healing was strange. Sometimes apologies arrived after damage became irreversible. Still, the acknowledgement mattered, not enough to repair trust, but enough to release something bitter she no longer wanted to carry. Her phone rang again later that night. Alyssa. Georgia answered softly. Hi. A child laughed faintly in the background now. Madeline sounded older already. Children kept growing regardless of adult destruction. How are you? Alyssa asked carefully. Georgia looked around her apartment. At the sketches, the olive tree, the peace. Better, she admitted. Alyssa laughed softly. You sound surprised. I am. They spoke more easily now. Not friends exactly. That would feel dishonest. But survivors recognized each other eventually. Alyssa updated her about Madeline's pediatric appointment and the small apartment she moved into outside the city. Jerome paid child support now through aggressively negotiated legal structures. Punctually. Coldly. Georgia suspected he treated fatherhood the same way he treated settlements, an obligation, not intimacy. Still, Madeline would be financially safe. Sometimes that was the best damaged men could offer. "Have you heard from him?" Alyssa asked quietly. Georgia understood immediately who she meant. No, that wasn't entirely true. Jerome occasionally sent short emails regarding final property logistics, always professional, always restrained. The emotional manipulation disappeared once legal boundaries became enforceable. Interesting how respectful some men became when consequences finally existed. Alyssa hesitated. "He tried calling me drunk last week." Georgia closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he did. Are you okay?" "Yeah," Alyssa said softly. "I didn't answer." "Good." That felt important somehow. After the call ended, Georgia walked slowly toward the large windows overlooking the city. Rain shimmered lightly across the streets below. Months earlier, she stood in another apartment believing her entire life was over. Now, not over. Different. There was grief still. Of course there was. Sometimes memories attacked unexpectedly. Certain songs, specific restaurants, the smell of Jerome's cologne on strangers passing too closely. Healing was not linear. It was tidal. But the difference now was this. The grief no longer owned her. A week later, Georgia returned to the mansion for the first time since the settlement. Final walkthrough before sale. The realtor met her at the front entrance with nervous energy. "Mrs." He stopped awkwardly. "Georgia." Georgia smiled faintly. "Georgia is fine." The house looked exactly the same. Perfect landscaping. Imported stone. Luxury without warmth. Yet something fundamental had changed. The illusion was gone. Georgia walked room by room slowly. The dining room where Alyssa stood holding the paternity test. The staircase where Jerome begged her to stay calm. The bedroom where she rediscovered the original company agreements. Every space carried ghosts, but none of them controlled her anymore. She paused inside the old kitchen. For years, she believed if she loved, harder gave more. Shrank smaller, the marriage would eventually feel safe again. Now she understood something painful and liberating. Love could not heal relationships built on entitlement. Only accountability could do that. And Jerome never wanted accountability. The realtor approached carefully. "The buyers are very interested." Georgia looked around one final time. The mansion was beautiful, but beauty without honesty eventually became exhausting. "Good," she said quietly. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed. "Rebecca." Georgia answered immediately. "You sitting down?" Rebecca asked. "Should I be?" "The Recovery Center project just secured major funding." Georgia froze. "What? A donor from Chicago loved your proposal. They're covering almost 40% of the construction expansion." For 1 second, Georgia couldn't speak. Emotion rose suddenly inside her chest so fast it hurt. Not because of money, because something she created from pain was becoming real. A place for women rebuilding themselves. A place built from survival instead of performance. Rebecca's voice softened. "You did that, Georgia." Georgia looked back toward the mansion one final time. The house Jerome once believed defined her worth. Then she looked out at the gray open sky above the trees. "No," she whispered softly. "I finally did something for myself." And somehow that felt more powerful than revenge ever could. The mansion smelled exactly the same. Cedarwood, polished marble, expensive candles Georgia used to replace every Sunday morning before guests arrived. Funny how spaces could preserve memory more faithfully than people. Georgia stepped through the front doors slowly while movers carried the last pieces of furniture toward waiting trucks outside. The house echoed now, empty, stripped of performance. For years it held curated dinners, forced smiles, carefully managed appearances. Now it was just walls and silence. Georgia walked through the foyer alone. Her heels clicked softly across marble floors she once chose personally from imported Italian samples. Back then, Jerome kissed her temple inside the showroom and said, "You make everything beautiful." At the time, she thought it was love. Now she understood something painful. Jerome loved what her devotion produced for him, not the cost of producing it. Georgia moved slowly toward the dining room, the exact room where everything shattered. She stopped in the doorway. The long table was gone now. No crystal glasses, no flowers, no elegant performance, just empty space beneath the chandelier. And suddenly Georgia saw it clearly. That night had not destroyed her life. It revealed it. The betrayal hurt because truth hurt, but truth also freed people eventually. Her fingers brushed lightly against the doorframe as memories flickered through her mind. Alyssa standing there trembling with Madeline in her arms, Jerome demanding calm while his entire second life collapsed publicly, Elaine protecting family image over family honesty, and Georgia herself standing in shock, believing she was losing everything. Funny, she lost the illusion, not herself. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere behind her. Georgia already knew who it was before he spoke. You came alone. Jerome. She turned slowly. He looked different now, not ruined, just reduced somehow. No perfectly tailored executive aura, no polished certainty. The confidence that once filled every room around him had thinned into something quieter. Human. Finally human. He wore a dark coat over a simple sweater, his hands shoved into his pockets like he no longer knew what to do with them. Georgia studied him carefully. This man once controlled her emotions with a glance. Now she only felt distance. Not hatred, distance. You weren't supposed to be here today, she said calmly. Jerome gave a faint, humorless smile. Technically, it's still partly my house until closing. Interesting. Still partly mine, even now. Georgia looked around the empty room. It never really felt like mine. Something flickered across his face at that. Regret, maybe. Too late regret. Jerome stepped farther inside. The silence between them felt strangely gentle now. Not warm, just no longer explosive. I heard about the recovery center, he said quietly. Georgia nodded once. The funding came through. That's good. She looked at him carefully. Months ago, she would have searched his face desperately for sincerity. Now, she simply observed. Jerome looked tired. Older. Consequences age people differently than time did. How's the company, she asked. A faint smile touched his mouth. Still standing. But without you. That one landed. Jerome glanced away briefly. The investigation ultimately forced him out quietly 3 weeks earlier. No dramatic press conference, no criminal charges, just reputational exile disguised as corporate restructuring. Powerful men rarely fell publicly anymore. They were usually relocated politely. Still, Jerome lost the one thing he loved most: importance. I built that company, he said softly. Georgia looked at him steadily. So did I. He nodded once after a long pause. I know that now. The sentence surprised her, not because it fixed anything, because it sounded honest. And honesty from Jerome still felt unfamiliar. Wind rattled faintly against the windows. Outside, movers continued loading the last remnants of their marriage into trucks. Jerome walked slowly toward the old living room. Georgia followed at a distance. Sunlight spilled across empty hardwood floors where furniture once stood. The entire mansion looked bigger, stripped of decoration, almost colder. Jerome stopped near the fireplace. You know, he said quietly, I used to think you'd never leave me. Georgia crossed her arms loosely. I know. His eyes lifted toward hers. No matter what happened, I thought you loved me too much. The honesty of it hurt strangely. Because he was right. She had loved Jerome beyond reason, beyond dignity sometimes. But love without boundaries eventually became self-erasure. Georgia walked slowly toward the windows. You know what the saddest part is? She asked softly. Jerome watched her carefully. You really believed my loyalty meant I'd tolerate anything. Silence. Then Jerome exhaled heavily. I was arrogant. Yes. No hesitation. No softening. Just truth. Jerome gave a faint nod, like he deserved that answer. Because he did. They stood quietly for a moment, watching winter light stretch across the empty room. Then Jerome spoke again. I did love you. Georgia closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The sentence women waited years to hear. Too late. Always too late. When she looked at him again, her voice remained calm. I think you loved being admired by me. Pain crossed his face instantly. Good. Not because she wanted revenge, because truth mattered now. Jerome stepped closer slowly. You really believe I'm that terrible, Georgia? Considered the question honestly. No, she said at last. That surprised him. I think you're a man who confused being needed with being loved. The silence after that felt enormous. Jerome looked away first. Interesting. He used to make her look away. Not anymore. You know, he said quietly after everything collapsed, I kept expecting you to come back. Georgia almost smiled sadly. Why? Because you always stayed. That sentence held the entire tragedy of their marriage inside it. Georgia inhaled slowly. Yes, she whispered. I did. She moved toward the staircase one final time. Her fingertips brushed the polished railing as memories flooded through her. Birthdays, arguments, lonely nights, hope. God, so much hope. Women mourn futures differently than men did. Men mourn losing comfort. Women mourn all the years they spent building dreams around people who never protected them properly. Jerome watched her carefully. Do you ever miss us? The question lingered heavily in the empty house. Georgia thought about it honestly. The answer surprised even her. I miss who I thought we were. Jerome lowered his eyes. That hurt him more than anger ever could, because fantasies dying permanently was harder than marriages ending. He took another slow step toward her. Is there any chance? He stopped. Georgia waited. Jerome swallowed hard. That someday we could start over. The old Georgia might have cried hearing that, might have mistaken regret for transformation, might have confused longing with change. But healing had sharpened her vision. She looked at Jerome for a very long time. Then she smiled softly, not cruelly, almost tenderly. Some doors don't close because of hate, she said quietly. Jerome's eyes locked onto hers. They close because peace finally has a key. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrived after truth instead of avoidance. Jerome looked shattered by the answer, but he also looked like he understood it. Finally. Georgia reached into her coat pocket and removed the final house key. She placed it gently on the empty fireplace mantel between them. Then she walked toward the front door. Jerome didn't stop her this time. That mattered too. Outside, cold winter sunlight flooded the driveway. Georgia inhaled deeply. The air smelled clean, alive. Her phone rang just as she reached her car. Rebecca, Georgia answered with a smile already forming. You sitting down? Rebecca asked excitedly. Georgia laughed softly. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because your recovery center just got national partnership backing. Georgia stopped moving completely. What? They loved your proposal. Georgia. This thing is becoming huge. Emotion rose sharply inside her chest. Not the painful kind this time. Something warmer, something freer. Georgia looked back at the mansion one final time. The house stood massive and beautiful behind her. But it no longer owned any part of her identity. For years, she believed surviving betrayal meant winning against Jerome. Now she understood something deeper. Healing was never about defeating the person who broke you. It was about rebuilding the parts of yourself they convinced you were too small to protect. Georgia opened her car door slowly, and for the first time in years, she drove forward without checking the rearview mirror. Some people think betrayal destroys a person, but the truth is far more complicated than that. Betrayal does not destroy you overnight. What truly destroys people is slowly abandoning themselves while trying to save someone who would never do the same for them. Georgia's story was never just about cheating. It was about what happens when a woman spends so many years making herself smaller for love that she forgets she was powerful before the relationship ever began. She confused sacrifice with loyalty, silence with peace, endurance with love. And like so many people trapped in emotionally manipulative relationships, she kept believing that if she just loved harder, gave more, forgave longer, things would finally change. But some people do not mistake your kindness for weakness by accident. They mistake it for permission. The hardest lesson Georgia learned was this: Love without respect will slowly turn into emotional loneliness. And no matter how beautiful the house is, no matter how expensive the lifestyle looks, no matter how convincing the public image becomes, a relationship built on manipulation will always collapse under the weight of truth eventually. What saved Georgia was not revenge. It was self-respect. It was the moment she stopped asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and started asking, "Why did I believe I had to earn basic honesty in the first place?" Healing did not come from Jerome's suffering. Healing came from Georgia finally choosing herself without guilt. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. You are not difficult for wanting honesty. You are not dramatic for reacting to betrayal. You are not weak because someone failed to value you properly. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is walk away from the life they prayed would work and build a new one anyway. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal, heartbreak, or emotional manipulation? Your story might help someone else feel less alone tonight. And if you enjoy emotional stories about healing, self-worth, karma, and powerful new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.